If I can get everyone's attention. We do have quorum in the room. Can I get everyone's attention, please? Thank you. And welcome to meeting 23 of the Planning and Growth Management Committee. Welcome to members of the committee, to the other members of the public in attendance, and to the members joining us today. For those in the room with us, the screen at the back of the room provides real-time updates concerning where we are and the agenda and what's coming up next. You can follow the agenda and debate on your computer, tablet, or smartphone at www.toronto.ca/council. And the Planning and Growth Management Committee gratefully acknowledges its meeting on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and home to many diverse Indigenous people. Are there any declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? I don't see any. Confirmation of the minutes from September 7th. Moved by Councillor Perks. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. We have a speakers list and some communications in front of us, and it's great to see that we have a quorum today. I appreciate that from all the members that are present. Let's look at the agenda that we have over here and go through it. Item 23.1, City Planning Division Study Work Plan Update. No one wishes to hold. Moved by Councillor Campbell. All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. PG 23.2, Residential Solar Panel Protection Provisions. It's a letter from Councillor Mihevc. Any wish to hold it? If not, I am more than happy to move Councillor Mihevc's recommendations.
Read the recs or referring?
And to refer it to staff to review his recommendations and come back here.
Is that
For their consideration. That's okay with everyone? I'll
clarify. He's asking the chief planner to report. So are we endorsing that, or are we asking the chief planner to consider whether or not they'll report?
Well, the motion that's drafted by staff would be for him to consider to report. But if you'd like him to report, then tell me what you like. So let me hold that down so I can find out, because we just adopted the work plan, how that would be able to fit into the work plan and be done. Because the work plan doesn't leave a lot of space. So if you don't mind, I'll hold that and then we'll come back to it if that's okay.
It could be a report on whether or not it should be included in the work plan.
No, it's our choice if it's in the work plan. I'll hold it down, see what we can work out, and we'll come back with a recommendation on it. PG 23.3, area-specific amendment to the city sign bylaw, 146 Bloor Street West. There are some speakers here, but I have been asked to defer that to an upcoming meeting. So I'll wait till 10 and do that if anyone, because it's a timed item for 10 o'clock. And if anyone still wishes to speak, let me know. Otherwise, we can hold the deputations until we come back with that. Item 23.4, it's also timed for 10 o'clock, 150 Sherway Avenue. 23.5 is timed for 10 o'clock. Area-specific amendment to the sign by law for 153 Dufferin Street. PG 23.6, Portland Planning Initiatives, final report. There were speakers on that. PG 23.7, Bill 139, proposed amendments to the Planning Act and the province's land use planning appeal system. There are speakers on that. PG 23.8, official plan indicators. There are speakers on that, so we're holding that as well. PG 23.9, Toronto Green Standards Review and Update. There are speakers on that, so we're holding that. PG 23.10, reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the building sector. There are speakers for that. So those items are held. There's an additional item, Councillor Perk, which you wanted to add to the agenda.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. If I could move to add an item 11, which is regarding the protection of dwelling units. I believe that's been circulated to the members. If we could add it to the agenda.
The item is here. A motion to add it to the agenda. All those in favor? Unopposed? Do you want to deal with it now?
I'd be quite happy to. I can explain it to the members in probably under a minute.
So if you could, and then I'll have actually it's questions of staff first. So to our acting chief planner, this is to come back in the second quarter of 2018 in the requested motion. I understand that your division would be okay with doing that?
We can proceed with an examination of the issue and get you a report in the early part of the year. Yeah.
Okay, because of its importance. Councillor, then any other questions of staff? Councillor Fillion?
It's actually a question of, perhaps of Councillor Perks, is this?
Then I'll let him speak to it, and then you can ask him. He wanted to speak to it. I would just questions of staff first. I did on it.
Well, I guess it's a question of staff then. Would this be a report on, would it be in reference to legal dwelling units? Or
It would
is that
be
not clear from the motion?
I think we would, through you, Councillor Shiner, the report would have to examine both the issue of legal and illegal dwelling rooms. There may be different issues related to illegal and legal. So we would want to canvass the issue fully.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Perks?
Yes, just very quickly, as
Sorry,
members know.
my apologies. I didn't see you, Councillor Camp.
So what is the definition of a dwelling room? Is it a kitchen? Is it a living room? Is it a bedroom? What is a dwelling
Through
room?
the chair, a room would have either cooking or sanitary, but not both. It converts to a unit if it has both.
So it would be, say that again, please?
A room would have either cooking or sanitary facilities, but not both. If it has both, it's a unit, it's a dwelling unit. So it's dealt with differently through zoning.
So this would be just a room with like a bed?
Might be a
Either a bathroom or a kitchen.
Bathroom,
Not
right.
both.
I have to let staff.
Okay. So you could have a bedroom with a kitchen, but no bathroom. Oh, sorry, my apologies.
So Councillor Fillion would like additional questions.
So,
ahead.
so this, a dwelling room that, as defined, would not be covered by the provision that protects rental housing. Is that correct?
That's correct. Our current policies protect dwelling units, 6 and above.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Perks then to speak.
Well, most of what I was going to say was covered by the very incisive and intelligent questions of staff, but just quickly, as you all know, we have a rental protection bylaw that says if someone comes along and wants to demolish or rebuild or reconfigure a property that has 6 or more dwelling units, there are certain obligations on the owner in terms of either compensating the tenants or finding them alternative housing or allowing them right of return. That does not apply when it's a dwelling unit. And as you heard from staff, the only difference is that with a dwelling room, one of the washroom facilities or cooking facilities are shared. Right now, in my ward, I have, because of increasing land value, I have a whole lot of tenants who are threatened with losing their homes. When they're in a building where it's dwelling units, I'm able to work with city staff to do something for those tenants so they can stay housed. When it's a dwelling room, I can't. I'll go to meetings of tenants who are under exactly the same threat, and because of this difference in how the units are zoned, people are losing their homes. And as you heard at council, we're losing this type of housing faster than we're building it. So in Parkdale, we estimate we have about 1,000 people who are in legal dwelling rooms. And within the next decade, we're going to lose half of those units, half of them, with no protection at all. And there's no compensatory housing being built for that population. it's often the most marginal, lowest income population in the city. While I appreciate there are going to be issues about legal ones and not legal ones and so on in various parts of the city, let's just simply ask staff to look at all that and give us their best advice on how we can navigate this complex issue and protect the most vulnerable tenants in the city of Toronto who currently don't have a protection. Just asking staff to give us advice on it at this point.
Thank you. I'll speak briefly. Councillor Perks brought this to my attention at council, where he was going to bring a notice of motion, and we discussed it and thought it best to bring it to committee, the appropriate route. I am in full support and understand the issues which he's brought forward, so I don't have to repeat them. What I think I have to do is caution staff about the difficulty of this issue, because you can go to other areas out of the core. Councillor Fillion, I think, would have the same as I would, where there's illegal rooming houses, and we're trying to deal with the issues that they cause for the neighbors when they start to disrupt it, in particular in townhouse settings where a small townhouse could end up being 6 illegal rooms in it near a college or a university facility somewhere. So it's a little more difficult than just what it seems on the surface and protect it, because we don't want to protect something that is really an irritant in the community and is there illegally. I support fully looking at it. I think we just have to remember different spots of the city are different. And when you come back, we have to remember that in the way that you report out to be able to protect what's right or currently permitted in each of those areas. Otherwise, the recommendations are here, moved by Councillor Perks. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried.
Thank you.
So we have 3 10 o'clock items, which we can't deal with until then. And the Portlands will take more than 5 minutes. It's at 10:30. So that will move us into 23.7, which is proposed amendments to the Planning Act and the province's land use and planning appeal system. We have speakers on that. So why don't we start with that? Mr. John Bossens, Federation of North Toronto Residents Association, and after that we have Kathy McDonald. There's only one other, but because we surprised you and actually worked efficiently to get here, we'll hold it down till later on, but you'll have to then sit and wait through a little bit of the other items. No problem at all, John. So I have 2 of the same speakers plus Hamish for item 8. Then item number 9. So 9 and 10, with the committee's approval, they'd like to do together, and staff had wanted to do a presentation on that. Are we okay with dealing with them together?
I have no objection to dealing with them together. On item 9, there's a sort of a complex technical issue I'm trying to work through with some staff, some of whom can't get here yet. So I don't know if we're.
I doubt we'll be making recommendations before we deal with the signs and the other items.
Okay, then sure.
I'd like to start with the presentations. We have some speakers, and then we can go to the timed items and try and work through those, if that's okay with members of the committee. So who's doing the presentation? 9 and 10. It's not me. I think we're surprising everybody, committee members. We're all here, we're all on time, and we're getting through items quickly. What a surprise. It's wonderful to see.
Here they come.
So do we have people if you're here? Thank you very much.
Maybe it's better when we don't. No, at 8:30 was a subcommittee of the House. Every week we need to know so $300 million we're spending. So that's in that subcommittee, so we have to go through the contracts they're putting out on the street. And then
surprised you by being so quick, haven't we?
And I think it's a hard argument.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I'm John Tory, I don't know what politically what I get. He didn't get any out of business. The bear maker.
No.
Yeah, well, that's probably holiday. I don't know what you give him leverage on because you already gave him a lot of credibility.
Are we almost ready?
Yep. Good morning, members of committee. I'm going to start the presentation while I believe the clerk's
Can
going to load.
I also ask, Will, that the two of you introduce yourself because you're on YouTube? Nobody knows who you are that's speaking. It would be great to do. Smile for all your YouTube guests.
Okay. Good morning. I'm Will Johnston. I'm the Deputy Chief Building Official for Toronto Building, and I'm going to be doing this presentation with Jane.
And I'm Jane Welsh, Project Manager with City Planning.
Okay. So I believe the clerk's going to load the presentation, but I'll start the presentation. So just first of all, this is a three-part presentation. And what the presentation does, it illustrates how the two reports that are in front of you support the city's overall initiative to achieve the goals of Transform TO. That initiative was recently adopted by council, I believe unanimously in the last few months. And Mark isn't here from Transform TO, but I will speak to his slide. Jane will provide you with an update to the Toronto Green Standard, and I'll end the presentation with an overview of how the current code consultation further advances the city's goals and objectives. Okay. So I believe you have a copy of the presentation. So I'm on slide 2. So this part of the slide is to provide you with a bit of context of how these two staff reports help to move Toronto's towards its climate change goals. Just as a reminder, in July of this year, City Council unanimously adopted the Transform TO Climate Action for an Equitable, Healthy and Prosperous Toronto report, and that's within the context of today's discussion that I'd like to highlight the following. So over 50% of Toronto's carbon emissions are associated with the heating, lighting and cooling of buildings. Recognizing that this Transform TO sets a series of world-leading goals and targets, 100% of new buildings by the year 2030 need to be built to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. The Toronto Green Standard is one of the key tools available to the city to achieve this goal. 100% of existing buildings must be retrofitted to the highest emissions reductions possible. The recommendations being made about the revisions to the Ontario Building Code also support the achievement of that goal. Showing leadership, all new city-owned buildings by 2026 must be near zero greenhouse gas emissions. To that end, we are already working towards a design for 3 new city-owned buildings to be net zero. In addition to helping achieve these goals, the reports before you also support Transform TO's targets around changing travel behavior and shifting transportation to low-carbon fuel options, and they also support the achievement of Council's goals around becoming a more resilient to a changing climate and extreme weather events.
To give you a brief overview of the Toronto Green Standard report that's before you. Basically, Toronto Green Standard has been required since 2010. It's a two-tier set of environmental performance measures to address the environmental concerns of the City of Toronto, and you can see those in the icons at the top of the page. To date, we've processed 1,300 development applications through the Toronto Green Standard, and we've also certified 20 Tier 2 buildings, and that's our highest performance standard that is incented through the development charge refund program. We have another 40 that are enrolled and another 70 that are interested. Really, if you think about it, the Toronto Green Standard has been a market transformation tool, and it's influenced the Ontario Building Code to have higher energy efficiency standards. So it's proven that, yes, you can build better buildings at a higher performance. The standard was developed, and the implementation of it is very much involved with our partner divisions, which include Environment and Energy, Toronto Water, Parks, Forestry and Recreation, Transportation Services, and Solid Waste. So when we were last here in 2013, Council asked us to investigate energy standards as a global best practice. What's out there? What's the best? And we did that. And the next study that we did was a zero emissions buildings framework. And that is how can we meet our goals for 2050 in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and how can we meet the target set out in Transform TO, which is to have 100% of our buildings to be near zero in 2030. So what we did was, the major recommendation was a shift from how we look at energy. So instead of modeling against a reference building, the shift is to set absolute energy performance targets. And those targets are thermal demand intensity, which is looking at how you can have passive design, the envelope, the orientation of a building, then looking at total energy use, which is everything to do with energy, including plug loads, and then also setting a target for our greenhouse gas emissions. So the big change in the Toronto Green Standard is we have 4 tiers. So this is our pathway to get to our target of near zero emissions by 2030. So what that means is the proposed Tier 2 in front of you today would become Tier 1 in 2022, and in 2036, Tier 3 would become Tier 1, and in 2030, Tier 4 would become Tier 1. So that is consistent with emerging provincial and national codes. So other changes for Tier 1, we do require, and this is the way we've always processed this, so Tier 1 takes a higher step. The energy model must be submitted that indicates a 15% improvement over the current 2017 building code, or you have the option to apply the absolute performance measures. And this is also the way we do things, is we introduce a new requirement in a voluntary way so that people have time to adjust and get used to it. In terms of Tier 2 applicants are required to meet the absolute performance targets. They also have a number of additional core requirements, including hooking up to district energy where it's available, completing a resiliency checklist, higher performance measure for stormwater management, solar-ready access. Now, we've also introduced Tier 3, so that includes performance targets for energy, water, and waste, and then Tier 4, as I was mentioning, being the highest energy performance target. We have 3 standards this time around, so we have all buildings and all other buildings, and then we have mid to high-rise residential. We have a low-rise standard because it's a different building type, and then we've consolidated our requirements for our own buildings into one standard. And if you recall, in spring this year, in 2017, Council did direct that all of our own buildings meet the Tier 2 standard. So this consolidates that here, and it does introduce a few additional things, such as bike parking and having green roofs that are pollinator friendly to the requirements for our own buildings. It also, we will be working with the Chief Corporate Officer to develop a absolute energy performance targets for our own city buildings.
Okay, I'm going to conclude the presentation by providing you with an overview of the province's code consultation process on the next edition of the code. What this presentation will show you is how the next edition of the OBC is well aligned with the city's goals of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the building sector. The results of this code consultation also demonstrate how the city's been successful in influencing the province in recognizing the needs of the city and developing the next edition of the code. So looking at the code development process in Canada, this slide just illustrates what the overall code development process looks like in the country and how Toronto participates and fits into that overall scheme. So first of all, national model codes at the national level are developed, and those become the base building codes that are used across the country. And until a province adopts that code, it doesn't become law. And what generally happens, provinces either adopt the National Building Code as their code, or they'll adopt parts of it. In the case of Ontario, Ontario uses the National Building Code as its base code and interjects into that code the requirements that Ontario feel are unique to Ontario and that they need to advance any goals that Ontario has. The current code that we're using today in Ontario is the 2012 code, which became effective in 2014. And so looking at this slide off to the right, back in June of 2016, the province introduced their climate change action plan, and there was 2 consultation processes that started on the next edition of the code that'll come in effect in come into play for the 2018 code. The first set of consultation was in the fall of 2016. With that consultation included was a number of housekeeping type amendments to the code to address a lot of the technical requirements around fire and life safety. The consultation process for fall of 2017, which is underway now, that consultation actually sets out the requirements in order to meet the requirements of the Provincial Climate Action Plan. And what we're seeing in that consultation, a lot of the items that are in there fully support and align well with Transform TO's objective, as well as what's in the Toronto Green Standard. All of this, over to the far right end of the arrow, all aligns with so the province's goal under the Climate Action Plan is to have buildings net zero greenhouse gas emission, near zero greenhouse gas emission buildings by 2030. And that goal aligns very well with the city's goals with respect to the Toronto Green Standard and Transform TO. So just talking a bit about how we proceeded with the consultation process. Toronto Building took the lead in leading the consultation on the 2018 code. And we did that by coordinating an interdivisional group with representation across the city to review all of the changes that are proposed for the 2018 code. The conclusion on that was that the changes that are proposed for the 2018 code all work well to advance the city's goals of minimizing the environmental impacts of buildings. Our report that's in front of you highlights the key areas where the code changes support the city's strategies. Next slide. And our recommendations that we have in front of you, there's 3 key recommendations. And the first recommendation is we're asking for council to request that the province continue on with the framework that they've set up. And this is a framework that allows municipalities to adopt higher levels of energy efficiency requirements in advance or that are set in the base code. So right now in the province of Ontario, a municipality can only adopt and require energy efficiency requirements that are set in the code. And what we had asked the province to do is, where a municipality like Toronto is in a higher state of readiness, give us the ability to adopt higher energy efficiency requirements ahead of what's in the base code. And so the good news here is the province did listen to that, and they've set the framework in place in the building code that allows us to do that. And what we're asking the province to do is to populate that list of energy efficiency requirements that municipalities can adopt when we're in a further state of readiness. Our second recommendation is around the province's setting requirements for existing buildings. And we feel that this is a good proposal that's in front of us. However, what we'd ask that the province do is consider what the impacts would be on the costs of implementing these requirements in existing buildings. And the reason for that is if the requirements so what the province will do is they'll say that when you renovate an existing building, you now have to add do energy upgrades to that building. And we want to ensure that the level of energy upgrades that are required under the provincial requirements aren't overly onerous, such that it actually drives the work underground and people wouldn't come in for a permit, or also that it becomes so expensive that it actually limits people doing that work. We also are asking that the province, when they're moving those requirements forward, that they include training for building officials as well as builders, so they understand what the requirements are when they do renovations to existing buildings. Our third recommendation is around climate change. So the proposal that's in front of us with respect to the 2018 code addresses some requirements to make buildings more resilient to extreme weather events. Our feeling is that the province could go further, and we're asking that the province consider further amendments to the building code to actually make buildings more resilient to extreme weather events. So just to conclude, it's our belief that the Toronto Green Standard and the Ontario Building Code are key components in our ability to deliver on the Transform TO initiative. And I think a good thing to mention here is that the Toronto Green Standard has been very successful at transforming the marketplace to actually allow builders, get us to a state where the market is actually producing buildings that are more energy efficient than we would normally see. And actually all of that is leading to us becoming and moving towards a higher state of readiness to allow us to adopt higher energy efficiency standards ahead of or above what's in the base code. We feel that all of these requirements help the city to continue to be a leader in reducing the environmental impact of the building sector while driving market transformation and regulatory changes. Thank you.
Thank you. Should we hear from the deputants? I think we should, and then we'll go back to the sign. There's 4 deputants on the...
So on that, Mr. Chair, there's at least one deputant I know who's part of the conversation I'm having with staff, and I'd appreciate if we could finish that conversation with staff before we go to deputations. It has to do with a tweak for the green standards, and we're working through whether that tweak is possible. It's after 10 o'clock. We could go to the sign items.
Well, we did do this, and I thought it would be nice to finish this item first, but I thought we could do the deputants in case they raise any issues, and then questions of staff, and then deliberations. And I think that would be appropriate to do, and if they raise an issue, there'll be a little bit of time here to deal with it. So I'd like to go to the deputants on PG 23.9. First one is Brian Purcell, Toronto Atmospheric Fund. And then after Brian, Gabriella Calapos, and then Emily Alfred. And then we're going to go to 2310 as well for DEPS, which will be Hamish Wilson. Brian, you know that we've been here before. The rules or the regulations are 5 minutes. Watch the clock. Please try and resolve it before that. If we have questions, we'll ask them of you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, councillors. My name is Brian Purcell. I'm the Director of Policy and Programs at the Atmospheric Fund. And so I'm here to talk about the Toronto Green Standard, which is one of Toronto's most successful climate policies, putting Toronto at the forefront of green development standards across North America. And it's time today for Toronto to take the next step forward in green building leadership by adopting Toronto Green Standard version 3. So the Atmospheric Fund strongly supports Toronto Green Standard version 3, which will put Toronto on the pathway to near zero emissions in new construction. We also support the 3 core recommendations on the next item, 23.10, with regards to the building code. We partnered with City Planning on a 2-year research and consultation project supported by the Environment and Energy Division, Toronto Building, and a stakeholder advisory group which included leading architects, engineers, developers, building operators, and the province of Ontario. The result was the Zero Emissions Building Framework, a roadmap that lays out the energy and greenhouse gas requirements for this update and all future updates through to 2030. Getting emissions from new construction under control is critical to achieving Toronto's 2050 climate target. That's why one of the key council-approved commitments in the Transform TO Climate Plan is achieving near zero emissions in all new buildings by 2030. Just how important is this goal? Well, Toronto's population is projected to grow by well over 35% by 2050. That means a massive build-out of residential and commercial real estate. If built to current standards, these future buildings could actually consume Toronto's entire 2050 carbon budget. So the importance of the 2030 near zero target was confirmed by the extensive modeling done for Transform TO. And simply put, if Toronto does not transition to near zero emissions in new construction, any progress we make in retrofitting existing buildings will be offset by growth. However, an ambitious goal is of little value without a plan. The Zero Emissions Building Framework is a transformative strategy for achieving the 2030 goal. We started by defining what near zero emissions means for Toronto, and we then worked backward to create interim performance targets for 2026, 2022, and 2018. This resulted in 4 tiers, Tier 1 being the proposed minimum design target, and Tier 2, 3, and 4 are voluntary stretch targets with a financial incentive for industry leaders. Then with every 4-year update, we eliminate the lowest tier until Tier 4, near zero, is the minimum standard in 2030. So with a series of targets and a clear timetable, the buildings industry will have the regulatory certainty that it needs to focus on optimizing the technologies and design approaches to cost-effectively deliver a low-carbon future for Toronto. The most critical change proposed is the transition to absolute performance targets. The Toronto Green Standard energy requirements have always been specified as a percentage better than building code. The problem is that percentage above code is almost completely uncorrelated with energy use or greenhouse gas emissions, which are the things we're trying to reduce. The city's Energy Efficiency Office has demonstrated this by analyzing a large sample of models that we receive under the Toronto Green Standard, and their findings have been replicated in other jurisdictions across Canada. So as a result, there's a growing shift towards performance targets, including most recently in Vancouver and British Columbia. Drawing on best practices from around the world, the framework uses 3 performance metrics that address Toronto's core objectives. Thermal energy demand intensity targets ensure high-performance building envelopes, which enhance resiliency by ensuring buildings will remain habitable for longer during power outages. Energy use intensity targets ensure lower energy costs for owners and operators and residents. And greenhouse gas intensity targets create a carbon budget for each building, ensuring steady progress towards near zero emissions. The shift to performance targets is a critical step on the pathway to near zero emissions. To ensure the proposed targets are technically and economically feasible, the project team ran thousands of building energy simulations. The most sensible strategies for achieving each tier were then evaluated for cost effectiveness. We found that all 4 tiers can be achieved using commercially available materials and technologies. The incremental costs in construction for Tier 1 are between 0.5% and 2.3% for different building types. This cost premium is well under 1% of the average sale value of new condominium units, closer to 0.5% or lower. And buildings will benefit from lower energy costs, resulting in net life cycle cost savings. New buildings will be part of our city for the next century. Building them efficiently is far more cost effective than retrofitting them later. Toronto Green Standard version 3 and the Zero Emissions Building Framework will result in enhanced resiliency, lower energy costs, and cumulative emissions reductions of over 30 megatons by 2050, as estimated through Transform TO.
Brian, I need you to wrap up.
Okay. We strongly recommend adoption of Toronto Green Standard version 3, which will put the first major policy in place to deliver on the Transform TO vision. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions of the deputant? Not seeing any. Thank you for coming. The next deputant we have is Gabriella Kalapos. Welcome, Gabriella.
And everyone else for your time. I just wanted to share a little bit of the Clean Air Partnership's input on the Green Standard version 3.0. The Clean Air Partnership would like to extend its strong support for the Toronto Green Standard version 3.0. Clean Air Partnership is a charitable environmental organization that works with municipalities and their partners to advance the implementation of actions that lead us towards low-carbon resilient communities. We also serve as a secretariat for the Clean Air Council, which is a network of 29 municipalities and health units across the Greater Toronto, Hamilton, and Southwestern Ontario region, working together on clean air and climate change initiatives. For over 5 years, the Clean Air Council has been working on furthering the adoption of municipal green development standards within their jurisdictions. I cannot express enough how instrumental Toronto's Green Development Standard has been in enabling this work with other municipalities. When Toronto came out with the version 1.0 of the Green Development Standard in 2010, its adoption was instrumental in identifying the role municipalities play in advancing more sustainable buildings. Since then, the CAC has been working to advance the adoption and outcomes achieved via municipal green development standards, and it has made a difference. Richmond Hill, Brampton, and Halton Hills have mandatory green development standards. Vaughan and Mississauga have a green development process in place for their development community as well. There is a critical mass of about 5 other jurisdictions that are in the process of developing municipal green development standards. I know the preference among many is for the Ontario Building Code to set the bar for energy efficiency and extreme weather resilience within its mandate so that there's a consistent direction that happens at the provincial level. And the direction the province has indicated within its climate change action plan and the Ontario Building Code consultation, which the Clean Air Council put some recommendations in, which I'll speak to shortly, is to move towards to net zero buildings by 2030. But it's important to keep in mind that if municipalities want to leave it to the province to be the sole implementer of that goal, that it will reach that goal far later and in a more costlier manner than if we collectively identify the role we can each play in accelerating the capability of the development contractor and purchaser market towards that goal. This update to the Toronto Green Standard shows a very clear, verifiable, yet prudent as well as ambitious way to advance Toronto's building tech sector towards that goal that we all share, to build the best buildings possible and to ensure that Toronto's growth is able to be accommodated in a way that advances our environmental, social, and economic prosperity. The Clean Air Council municipalities, as part of their consultation on the Ontario Building Code, have recommended that the province follow the same goal that has been identified in the update to the Toronto Green Standard, that the OBC adopt a stepped approach towards net zero buildings by 2030, identifying tiers of performance towards moving the market towards that goal. It is important to keep in mind that when the required standards that are part of the Ontario Building Code have to take an extremely large geographical area into consideration, a geographical range where the market significantly differs. If municipalities rely solely on the Ontario Building Code to move their market, they will end up with a lot more buildings within their community that only need to be retrofitted within a decade's time and at a higher cost and a poorer result than if they had built to those standards at the time of construction. Enabling Ontario municipalities to move ahead on the minimum move ahead of the Ontario Building Code standards will benefit their own residents and businesses, as well as the entire province, by building industry capability at a smaller scale. Successful adoption of standards at the municipal scale can then inform and be integrated into future updates to the Ontario Building Code and move the market more quickly and effectively across Ontario. Municipal leadership, however, is required in order to advance the market and be able to protect residents and businesses from energy price increases and extreme weather impacts. There is no doubt that there is an affordability issue associated with purchasing real estate in Toronto and across the GTHA as a whole. However, this only reinforces the need for municipal leadership towards ensuring that buildings being built within their community are able to meet both the short and longer-term needs of their occupancy. The upfront capital cost increases associated with better building envelopes and improved water, waste, and energy building systems are paid for many times over the life of that building through operational cost savings. And if you'd like to know more about some ideas that we have for how to actually deal with those upfront capital costs, I'm sure I'd be happy to answer any questions that people have. I'm here to encourage Toronto to continue to show the green standard leadership that Toronto is known locally and internationally for. And I can assure you that what you decide to do today with this update to the Toronto Green Standard will set the bar for where other municipalities in the region decide to go with their green development standards. It will also likely play a significant role in determining where the province goes with their update to the Ontario Building Code. I am sure that you all got into municipal politics because you wanted to make your communities better places to live, work, and play, and the Toronto Green Standard is one way to help you do that.
I need you to sum up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions of Gabriella? Councillor Campbell.
I thank you for your deputation. Do you think that the Ontario Building Code is too lackluster in terms of upholding green standards?
I think the challenge with the Ontario Building Code going to the highest level it can possibly go to is a result of the fact that Ontario, when it sets its Ontario Building Code, has to take this huge geographical range into consideration, where there's a very different capability in the market. It's hard to compare what's available in terms of the market acceleration that could take place in Toronto as opposed to North Bay or Timmins. So it has to take all of those kind of huge market capabilities into consideration, and as such, it has to set a bar lower than what can be achieved in smaller jurisdictions like Toronto or within the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area.
So would you say that the Torontonians are not well served by the building code?
I don't think that's, I think Torontonians could be better served by enabling municipalities to go above the Ontario Building Code within a jurisdiction where the market's able to handle it. And Toronto is certainly able to handle a higher bar in terms of market capability of better buildings than the Ontario as a whole.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Thank you. Councillor Perks, you had a question?
Thank you. Hi, Gabby. So we saw in the presentation from staff that over half of our emissions are building related, and council has adopted some fairly ambitious reduction goals. Can we get to those goals if we don't adopt a more accelerated approach on building code?
No.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions to the deputant? Not seeing any. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Emily Alfred, is Emily here? Off in the corner there. Welcome, Emily. You have 5 minutes. You can use all or part of that to speak to us, and if there are questions, we will come back to you after, and you can watch the clock yourself.
Great. Good morning. My name is Emily Alfred. I'm the waste campaigner for the Toronto Environmental Alliance. So I'm here to say first that T fully supports the Toronto Green Standard version 3. We think that this is a great way for Toronto to show it's moving forward. It sets a great ambitious targets for improving energy efficiency and meeting Toronto's environmental goals. We also think that this is an important plan to getting us to our 80% greenhouse gas reductions by 2040. However, we have some concerns that I think can be resolved with some minor tweaks if we have the time to look at this, with the waste portion of the Toronto Green Standard. We feel that the requirements for Tier 1 are not as ambitious and don't necessarily match the ambition of the other sections of the Toronto Green Standard, and it doesn't necessarily fit with the Toronto's long-term waste management strategy, which was passed in 2016, nor the direction of the Waste Free Ontario Act and the Circular Economy Strategy, which was also passed in 2016. So, to talk about waste, it's important to know that waste is actually, there's growing awareness that waste has a very big impact on greenhouse gas emissions. Ontario knows that this is addressing waste and increasing diversion is a very important way for us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions at the provincial level and at the city level. The long-term waste strategy set out some ambitious targets to reduce waste, not only in buildings that the city has direct control and provides waste services for, but for the entire commercial sector and to address construction demolition waste. The province similarly has recognized that construction demolition waste and addressing waste diversion in commercial buildings and non-residential buildings is an important way for us to make sure we meet our goals. So this, to me, looks like a really good opportunity for us to provide more guidance for buildings to reduce their waste. Some examples are requiring that all buildings, not just residential buildings, provide space for recycling and organics diversion, and provide a bit of flexible space for future diversion programs. One thing that the long-term waste strategy noted and that we've heard from many people is the reason a lot of businesses and multi-res buildings don't have better waste diversion programs is they say they simply just don't have the space for all the bins. So being forward-thinking and being progressive and looking into the future, we should start planning for more diversion space in all buildings so that that couldn't be an excuse that would slow people down with their waste diversion programs. We also know that the province over the next 4 years is going to be introducing a great number of waste diversion programs, including waste recycling requirements for textiles, small appliances, and a lot more hazardous waste and different materials, including requiring all businesses to start collecting organics. So this is an important thing that Toronto can get ahead of and make sure that our buildings are ready for this. I also think that requiring more diversion of construction demolition waste is a very easy, low-hanging fruit that this green standard could address. Construction demolition waste is very recyclable. It is very predictable material streams. It could be very easily diverted. Unfortunately, with low enforcement from the province, there's actually very low diversion rates among construction demolition projects. Construction demolition projects over a certain size in Ontario are already required to develop waste management plans and waste diversion plans and provide source separation for recycling and all the different materials on site. These requirements already exist. It's not a big leap, I think, to require that these sort of things happen in Toronto buildings. So that's my quick summary. Sorry, I just looked at the Green Standard yesterday and saw this and thought this is a good opportunity for us to push a little bit further ahead. It's a real opportunity with some minor changes. I think it could really be in spirit with the long-term waste strategy and the circular economy strategy, since those are very important goals.
Thank you very much. Councillor Perks had a question of you.
So, Emily, I just want to make sure I got the main gist of it. So the two things that I think I heard most clearly were that we have to make sure that there's adequate sorting space so that streams such as hazardous waste or compost can be picked up?
Yes.
And secondly, that the standards should apply across all categories, not just residential.
Yes.
Okay.
Those are sort of the same. So about providing adequate sorting space for all buildings.
Right.
Currently, the way it's written, it's only required for residential buildings.
I see.
Because that's where the city has the most expertise, because that's where the city serves. But the way it's written, even city-owned new buildings would not be required to have adequate sorting space for diversion. And I think that's a very easy gap to fill. And then the second issue is around construction demolition waste and requiring recycling. So like the state of California, Vancouver, and other major cities have set in these requirements that when people do construction or demolition projects, they're required to prove that they reused, recycled, or otherwise diverted 50 to 90% of the materials on site.
That's all, Mr.
Thank you. Councillor Campbell has a question.
So just following up on that, on the construction demolition materials, is there any portion of that element that's recycled now in Ontario, or is almost all of it just off to landfill?
It's hard to say because there's not a lot of clear reporting from most waste information in Ontario comes from municipalities who have very strict reporting requirements. But when it comes to the private sector, there's a lot less clarity and a lot less transparency. So there is a high level of recycling that may be happening, but it's not clear. I know a lot of stuff gets
And there's
jumbled
no
into-
provincial standard or no provincial requirement, or the province is absent on this?
The province does require, but they're not very good at enforcing the regulations right now. They're revising them as part of their circular economy strategy work as well. But they've identified that construction demolition waste is an area that, you know, Ontario and Toronto could easily solve.
But does the province have a regulation in place that directs companies to, you know, recycle these materials?
For large sites, for large commercial buildings, large institutional industrial buildings, and for large construction sites over 2,000 meters squared, they are required to show that they have a source separation program. But there are some loopholes and some gaps in those regulations that don't necessarily result in the type of diversion that we're looking for. So the province is revising those regulations. So I think Toronto has an opportunity to reinforce those regulations and ensure that it applies to smaller projects as well.
And what about houses?
For house,
I mean, is there any provincial standard in regard to house demolitions?
I'm not totally sure about that one. I know it's for projects, construction projects over 2,000 meters squared. I don't know if it goes by building or by the overall project.
Okay, thank you. That's all, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions. Thank you very much, Emily, for coming. And on item number PG 23.10, we had Hamish Wilson. Is Hamish here? I don't see Hamish Wilson here. That's the only speaker I had on that item. Yes, ma'am. You're standing for a reason. And your name is? Sorry? I don't see Mr. Wilson here, and you'd be the last deputant. So, sorry. You'd like to sign up, or you did give clerks your information? I'm sorry. So, I'm just making sure I'm doing everything right. Please sit down, but be sure you give the clerks again your information after. And you are the last speaker I have on this. Mr. Wilson isn't here. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Again, can you tell us your name?
Sure. My name is Sheena Sharp. I am here on behalf of the Ontario Association of Architects. The OAA is a regulatory body created by the province and to regulate the practice of architecture. So in addition to all the bad stuff like complaints and discipline and that, we also are tasked with promoting the art and science of architecture for the good of the public. And so that's why we do things like this. And to be clear, we are very supportive of the Toronto Green Building Standard version 3. If you passed it as is, we would be very happy. However, in context, we'd like to talk a little bit about the energy portion and highlight the fact that you're going to energy use intensity, which is a really, really important step. It's a little bit technical, But for example, if I was designing a residential tower, I would be, under the current approach, I would be comparing my design to an imaginary design that has all the same flaws as my design. And this is not very useful. A lot of poorly energy designed buildings get through the process and pass with flying colors for this reason. When you go to energy use intensity, you're comparing your design to all of the other designs out there. So the method has far more integrity, it's far simpler, it's far easier for building owners to understand, and not only that, it's aligned with the way that the city, with the way that the UN, with the way that the province looks at reductions, which is to benchmark what buildings are using today, the existing buildings, and so we take our new building against the existing buildings and we slowly get better. So we think that this approach is very, very important, and we congratulate the developers of the standard for moving to this approach. If we were to make this standard stronger, we note that Tier 1 still allows the reference proposed buildings methodology, and that most buildings go through Tier 1, and that's certainly our experience in working with the city, in the City of Toronto. And so if we were to make it stronger, we would get rid of that performance reference building approach for Tier 1, just take out that compliance path. And the second recommendation we would have is you now have 5 categories of buildings, which are the key categories. You'll probably capture 70% of the construction in Toronto with those categories, but we would expand those categories. And so those are the 2 recommendations we would have for making it better. But make no mistake, if you pass it as is, we will think it's quite a significant step forward. One other thing that we would like to note is that we've been working in this space a long time. We actually adopted an energy use intensity standard for architects about 10 years ago, and we've been kind of forcing it on them. But we have also noted that there is a bit of an energy literacy gap, both with some architects, engineers, and regulators, our plans examiners and the buildings department. And so we're working together. We have a project right now funded by IESO that we're working together to automate some of the checking of energy models, which I think will make everything much easier. And so, and it's kind of a reflection of our commitment to actually getting to our goals and to making sure that everybody involved in the system has the best possible tools they can to get there. So in closing, just congratulations, please pass this, and thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Sheena. Are there any questions at all? Not seeing any. Thank you for coming. Committee members, there was one more person that got added to the list, which was Michael Mesher. Is Michael here? I don't see Michael coming up forward. So I'm going to go on with this now, and thank you for going forward with this. If he's not in the room, I can't wait. We have far too many people here. Are there questions of staff that anyone has? Councillor Campbell.
Thank you. Yeah, questions of staff. Where is staff? In regard to the presentation, I wanted to know what a building looks like that has near zero emissions.
Like a building that has terrible
What is a building that has near zero emissions? What is a building that has near zero emissions? I'd like to know not what it's designed as, but I mean what kind of performance does it have? What are the performance measures that we're talking about?
Through the chair, I can try to take a stab at that. My name's Lisa King.
Sorry if that question was a little vague, but I mean
No, it's a very good question. A near zero emissions building has very high envelope thermal performance. It tends to have a lower window-wall ratio, so less glazing, triple pane windows. It has very high-efficiency mechanical systems, including energy recovery ventilation. It would probably use air source heat pumps. It reduces the energy load to such an extent that there's a downsized mechanical system, which actually means that the overall capital cost premium for a Tier 4 building is lower than a Tier 3 building. You'll see in our our study, which is kind of interesting.
The capital cost is lower.
Yes. But there are some new technologies and possible policy implications over time that we want to learn about Tier 4 buildings. But they also tend to retain their indoor temperature better because of that high-performance building envelope when there's no power. So that's a resiliency co-benefit.
So how energy efficient are all of these glass towers that have sprouted up in the last 10 to 15 years? And yeah, why don't you just answer that question? How energy efficient are all these buildings?
Well, the energy efficiency varies by which code applied at the time of construction, but they would certainly meet the Ontario Building Code requirement of the time. And
so, but you mentioned that, you know, a building that is energy efficient doesn't have all of that glass and glazing. It doesn't have that particular characteristic, but so many of the buildings that have been built in Toronto are exactly all of that. And so I asked the question earlier about the Ontario Building Code. Are we looking to the province to strengthen the Ontario Building Code so that there's less of that type of building occurring?
Yeah.
So through the chair, the proposal or the proposed code for 2018 will start to address that because the buildings will be more energy efficient. So you will start to see some shifts in that, in the glazing ratios potentially and that type of thing.
And how will that be reflected in the code?
So the code will require through the standards that designers need to design their buildings for. Those standards will be updated so that they will have to design their systems in the buildings to be more energy efficient.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Perks, questions?
Yes, thank you. So we're sort of winging it here, but we just had a little conversation. I want to make sure I understood correctly the outcome. Emily from the Toronto Environmental Alliance raised two concerns. The first was that we're not requiring recycling space, either for compost, hazardous waste, or whatever, in ICI buildings, but we do require it in residential buildings. Can we make part of the plan review process for ICI buildings the same as what we do for residential buildings, namely that they have to have recycling sorting space? I'll give you a hint. I was just told yes.
You have to let them tell us.
I know.
Otherwise, you can do it as a statement.
I was asking Vince if we can, just as we require loading space.
Is there an answer to the question?
Yeah, Vince was out of the room, so I'll just ask him again. Can we require that ICI buildings, just as residential buildings, have recycling space during plan review?
Well, through the chair, when we review residential development applications, we do look at the capability of having appropriate space capacity for diversion programs and also for collection. So a similar approach can be adopted for non-residential with one caveat. When we do look at residential applications, we look at it also from the perspective of potential collection as a customer. That would not apply to non-residential applications, so I'm not expanding my scope for collection, but we can certainly look at the feasibility of having waste diversion programs or designated collection areas to allow for diversion.
Thank you. My second question, it was also raised during a deputation that currently the province requires that for buildings over a certain amount of size, the builder file a recycling plan for construction demolition waste. However, the province, and it's not only in this area, doesn't really enforce it. Could we, as part of our requirements in the green standards, require simply a filing of that same document with us that they file with the province, who, as far as I can tell, puts them in a pile and forgets about them?
Again, through the chair, receiving those plans for reporting purposes is something we can certainly request. Again, we're not in a position to enforce It's Regulation 10394 that the council is referring to, provincial regulation. We would not be enforcing that regulation, but we can certainly receive the plans for our information.
Thank you very much, been most helpful.
Thank you. Are there any other questions, members? Maybe if staff can help me with one. Go to a higher standard to build, it normally costs more money. You go to a higher standard to operate, it should save money. Do you have any idea what the costs would be either on a per square foot or a per unit basis to construct more efficient the different tier buildings and what the savings would be? Or what the payback would be on those?
Certainly through the chair, through our zero emissions.
Through the chair to the chair.
We did an estimate of the cost for residential to the increased cost. So for Tier 2, version 3, it would be between 2 and 3.5%. For Tier 3, it would be between 3 and 6% of overall construction costs, and this is for residential and commercial. And for Tier 4, it would be 3.6 to almost 5% cost. There is a payback. We don't have that number, though.
Do you have any idea what it is? Or any idea how long it would take to get the payback?
Through the chair, we did do a 25-year life cycle cost analysis as well as look at the capital cost premium as a portion of total construction costs by building type. So generally for Tier 1 and 2, it shows a positive life cycle return or benefit to the city. When you move up in the tiers, obviously it varies a little bit. There's some negative. It assumes today's construction costs and products, for example, and codes when it's determining that benefit. But overall, yeah, for the Tier 1 and Tier 2, there's definitely a net benefit.
Thank you. Okay, no other questions? Speakers? Councillor Perks, did you have? Are there other members of the committee that wish to speak? I will. I have a motion. So I'll give you a little bit of chance then, Councillor Perks, to finish your motion. But not a lot of time because we have a lot of people waiting here for other items. So it's direct the Acting Chief Plan Executive Director, City Planning, to explore additional financial and non-financial incentives to encourage developers to meet Tier 2 of the Toronto Green Standards version 3 and report back to the committee before the end of the second quarter of 2018. And City Council requests Build Toronto and the Toronto Realty Agency to consider the application of, at a minimum, Tier 2 of the Toronto Green Standard version 3 standards as part of their development agreements with future owners of land. The first one is, let's see if we can find any other incentives. I think that's self-explanatory. Right now, you do get some development credits, but there isn't enough to offset the cost. The second part is we do have land that we put out for redevelopment. In that, we look at city building initiatives, and we're looking at a lot more now than we ever looked. We used to just highest price we could get for a piece of land, it was sold, and on some occasions it caused some concerns because we sold city land and the purchaser didn't agree with what we wanted and was appealed to the board. Now we start to set these standards. We look at those standards and we look for affordable housing. We look at city building initiatives. We look at how we can save heritage buildings. We look at public amenities of the buildings, and we're very respectful of the neighbors. I think if we're going to be leaders across the country in trying to have energy efficient buildings, we should look at ways that we can do it with our own properties. The bottom line is, it's money. It costs a little bit more to build them, but it saves a lot more in the long term, both in the cost of operating for the people that live in those buildings and to our environment, if we can be those leaders. So in this case, we're looking for them to consider that. We're not directing that. I think that's what the board can do with the new agency when it comes in January and look at the cost. But I think it's something we should do. And many of you may see, if you look at a development project all the time, and my colleague was bringing up these wonderful glass towers. Glass is not the best insulator. We all know that. You cannot give the same insulation factors or environmental factors to that. In fact, the glass allows the heat to come in the summer, which heats up buildings, when you can find European buildings where they actually have shutters that go down on the outside and close when the sunlight comes to stop that heat coming in. We are permitting buildings that are quite backwards to what you really want to see. You're letting the heat out in the winter and the heat in the summertime when you're trying to do the opposites. And our standards then allow us to become leaders in that. And I think we can do that both by encouraging it across the city and here. And for those people that buy a condominium, tell me how many people went in with an estimated per square foot maintenance fee and actually found that it was equal to or less because of the cost very often of the energy and the maintenance of the building itself. There are always these estimates that seem to be sub what they are when people take over, and you have your 600 or 700 square foot unit, even if it's small, and you got $300-400 a month, and you could end more like $500 a month in maintenance fees. It's a killer. So we can do more, and these standards will do that. So I'm very supportive and appreciate the work that the staff have done. I think it's great moving it forward. I'd like to try and demonstrate that where we can within our own buildings, and that's the reason for my motions and my support for the staff recommendations. Councillor Barlow, do you have a question of me?
I was just wondering, because you asked, I think, an important question on the additional costs, but also on the additional savings, and we didn't get an answer on the additional savings. And I think as we create incentives and we have these conversations with the development industry out there, it is really important to put out there those numbers just as much as it is what it costs. So I was wondering if you wouldn't mind adding that, to ask staff to come back with a study on that, so that when we're having these conversations, we can actually show, because we're going to get pushed back right away saying it's going to cost more. So we need to show that, yes, it might cost you more a little bit at the beginning, but this is the savings that is going to translate at the end of the day in your project and for the end user as well. So I think it's really important that we get those numbers. So I don't know if staff requires us to direct them on that, or if...
Can we take it offline? Because if it was easy to do, and that's why I didn't push, I normally push for a firm answer. If it was easy to do, we probably would have been told it when it's more estimates. I think if we could, through the acting chief planner and staff, maybe we can look at how we assume that. And again, we'll have that opportunity when we look at those costs when you're selling a property with a development proposal on it. If you'd like it as a motion, then you're welcome to move it as a motion as well. I think we can do both ways and ask them to come back, but I don't think it's as easy as let's just do a quick study. I think it's a difficult thing to ascertain, if I'm correct. You're more than welcome to move that. Councillor Perks, did you wish to speak, or do you have a question?
Of you, sir.
Yes, Councillor.
Then I wish to speak. Just in terms of your motion number one, I assume that, and this is following on what Councillor Bailao was getting at, when that report comes back, there will be some more robust analysis than we currently have in terms of whether it's even needed. It may be that for certain aspects of the development standard, the payback is so swift, we don't need to incent it any further. So I imagine you're expecting a little bit of analysis like that when your report request comes back. Correct?
My understanding is that the credit for the development charges is a small credit, not a major credit that's in there, and it doesn't offset the cost of going to the standards. And I'm actually looking to find ways to go to tier 3 as well. So when they come back, they can be quite fulsome in their review of it, and it may be the time as well. Hopefully they'll take into it from the discussion how the payback can be in place. I think that's all important.
Good, thank you. I think that solves it for me.
And then you wish to speak?
Sir. Okay, so I have a motion to amend the Toronto Green Standard to A, require all building types to provide diversion space, and B, require developers to file a construction, demolition, waste recycling plan with the city on the same basis as required by the province. We heard from staff that these two things are doable, and further, very clearly would help us to meet both our long-term solid waste goals and, more important, also our environmental goals for climate change. One of the huge drivers of climate change is actually all those materials with embodied energy being sent to landfill instead of recycled, and not having the room within the ICI buildings to be able to set up diversion programs for organics, which I understand the province is looking at making a requirement. So this actually is getting in place the things for these buildings that will allow us both to meet our long-term waste plan and our climate change plan. I wanted to address generally, though, the report that's in front of us. First, I want to acknowledge the importance of the role that former Deputy Mayor Joe Pantalone had in this. We were the first municipality in North America to have a unique homegrown green standard for buildings that came out of a roundtable on environment chaired by Deputy Mayor Pantalone between 2007 and 2010. And I'm glad to see that Toronto continues to lead, continues to push the envelope. As you heard from one of the deputants, once we got this done, municipalities all over Greater Toronto have started to emulate what we're doing here. And I'm sure that once we push the bar even further, we will also be emulated. So the work we're doing here is not only having benefit in terms of Toronto's environmental performance, but in terms of environmental performance right across the province of Ontario. And that's something we should be quite proud of. I think it's also worth noting, having seen, I think, 5 different climate plans approved over the last 2 decades in the City of Toronto. What's unique about this one is here we are just a month or 2 later from getting our environment plan approved, and we're actually seeing action happening department by department. It's miraculous. It's incredibly impressive, and the work done is also very persuasive. It shows how we'll both be avoiding future expenditures as a city and also saving building owners future investments. So it's a win-win-win-win. Probably there's another win in there too. I encourage you all to support this both here and at Council. It's one of the things that makes me proudest of being a member of this Council, the great lengths we go to try to achieve the highest climate change standards.
Councillor Campbell, questions of Councillor Perks.
On number two,
Yes.
you said on the same basis as is required by the province.
That's correct.
So does that mean that developers, and also I've got another point, so that means developers are already required to do this by the province? Because you've said as a
Yes, the province of Ontario has a series of regulations under their Waste Management Act that pertain to industrial commercial buildings. I can tell you right now that having watched the province deal with those for the last 25 years, there is zero enforcement of them. Zero enforcement of them. So they're required to file a construction demolition plan for buildings over a certain size. The document goes to the province, it's put in a filing cabinet and forgotten. We tend to be a little bit more activist of a government, so I think developers who are filing plans with the city as part of the development review, this will put on public record and with us, the city, that they have a construction demolition plan, which we can use when we're devising our construction management plans, which we do already.
So this would require an effort on the city's part to monitor and review the process?
Not necessarily. Because the city is the body that manages and the relationship with the developer already, simply the fact that they're filing a document with us will change how they think about it. That's one. Two, we already have to monitor the construction, demolition, and rebuild process for these sites. We have another number of requirements through our plan review process. There's something called a construction management plan. Already we have city staff allocated to making sure that the requirements in those plans are met. So I don't foresee it as being additional staff resources. I see it as those staff resources being applied to get even better outcomes.
And then my last question is about developers. How all-encompassing is that term, developers? Is a developer just doing a site with an office building, or is a developer or a condo, or is a developer also demolishing homes and building townhouses or whatever?
You've hit the nail on the head as to why I put in on the same basis as required by the province. They have a minimum square footage below which it does not apply.
So why limit it to that?
Precisely because then you wind up having to create a whole lot more work in areas where the city doesn't do the work.
Okay.
Yep.
Councillor Perks. I believe your comments before were in regards to non-residential building types, and I was asking for clarification from staff.
Yes.
And They believe, I think, the words all non-residential building type.
Okay.
So are
Very
you
good.
okay with an amendment to
Yeah.
that?
I'll always take Mr. Lintern's use of the English language over my own.
We just didn't want to see every little single-family home having to, or other one having to have that when it wasn't meant for that. Are there any other speakers? Not seeing any, so we have two motions, one by myself. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. One by Councillor Perks. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. The item is amended. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Thank you very much. So now we had 3 sign items for 10 o'clock. I can turn to those. There is a deputant for item number 3, PG 23.3, area-specific amendments to the city's signed bylaw 146 Bloor Street West. I had Michael Foderick here. Michael, would you be satisfied? I'd like to move a motion to defer this to the January meeting. Are you okay then to see if we have any other amendments and come back then and not speak today?
That's exactly when we'd asked for it to be deferred to, and I'd add that the local councillor respects that date as well for January. And it would be difficult to comply with the notice for the November meeting in any event, so.
All right, so I am moving, or you are, I'm moving a deferral of item number PG 23.3 to the January meeting. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried.
Thank you.
PG 23.4, area-specific amendment to the city's signed by law 150 Sherway Drive. It's a follow-up. I see Mr. Wolowich is here. Mr. Wolowich, if we adopted the staff recommendations, would you be happy? I would. So we don't have to hear from you because that's what you're here to support. That's correct. Okay. Is there a mover of the staff recommendations? There's 2 of them. Well, I'll go by Councillor DiCiano, being the area that he represents. The staff recommendations are PG 23.4 in front of us. All those in favor? Any opposed? That's 1 opposed. That's carried. You've done a wonderful job today, Mr. Wolowich. Thank you. Thank you for allowing us to catch up with the agenda. PG 23.5, area-specific amendment to the sign by law for 153 Dufferin Street. So, Mr. Wolowich, you were here for that one. So if we were to adopt the staff recommendations on that one, would you be happy with that? Is there a mover of the staff recommendations? There's 2 of them. This one is Councillor Campbell. Are there any speakers on it?
Please.
There are no speakers on it. We have the vote. Recorded vote has been requested on it. All those in favor?
All those in favor, Councillor Bailao, Councillor Campbell, Councillor Ciano, Chair Shiner, Councillor Fillion. All those opposed, Councillor Perks. That motion carries.
Thank you very much. So now we can move on to our 10:30 item, which is the Portland's planning initiatives.
Before we move into that, I apologize, but item 10, we didn't adopt that, so
Oh, I have to officially adopt item number 10, my error.
are you moving the
And that
staff
is reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the building sector response to the fall 27th Ontario Building Code consultations. I'll move the staff recommendations. All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. So now we are here for the Portland's planning framework, and we have someone very eager to give us a presentation after an awful lot of work on this. So we will have a presentation on this first from our staff, and then we'll go to deputations. Yes, we're going to, if it's okay with the member's presentation, deputations, questions of staff, and then we can go to speakers. You're waiting for me, waiting for you?
Just being polite.
Let's go.
Good morning, Chair and Committee. I'm the Acting Chief Planner, Greg Lintern. With me is the Project Manager on Portland's file, Cassidy Ritz. It's a pleasure this morning to share with you 4 years of planning work that has been undertaken by the city's Planning Division, Waterfront Toronto, and the Toronto Region Conservation Authority in partnership. I certainly want to thank all of those organizations for working hard and collaboratively together to produce this result for your consideration this morning. You're going to hear this morning from staff and certainly from the deputants, as we have throughout this process, that there are many perspectives about the Portlands, and that's completely understandable. It's a very large area, and it embraces, I think, the vision that we're proposing embraces in a very inclusive manner a wide range of interests going forward, setting down a vision for the Portlands over a long period of time. For those of you who are not familiar with the Portlands, and that too is understandable because it is such a vast area, it's a bit of an undiscovered area in the daily life of Torontonians. What we're talking about today is generally southeast of the downtown, at the foot of the Don Valley, a large area that is actually home to over 5,000 people that work there, which is always a surprising fact. It's home to what has been described as a very glorious public space, which is known as the Ship Channel. Many interesting, evocative heritage buildings and other significant attributes that we feel will form the basis of the future character of building a series of neighborhoods in the Portlands. Another sometimes overlooked fact is that the land ownership pattern is very different than the rest of the city. Predominantly, the rest of the city is in we're dealing in development with vast amounts of private ownership. Here, it's the reverse. We're dealing with a lot of public ownership at various levels of government, and although there are some strategic privately held parcels. This is important because it provides an opportunity to lever and further influence change as the area evolves over time. What we're here today to talk to you about is both the Portlands Planning Framework and the Villiers Island Precinct Plan. The middle part of your screen, the important transportation and servicing master plan that underpins a lot of this has been completed and is out in the public record. So the framework that we've got for you today represents a vision and directions and recommendations. Really, it's the next chapter in a story that began 100 years ago when the Portlands was created by the federal government. The policies, the recommendations and directions that are in front of you really cover a wide range of policy areas. In summary, they move the area forward. They allow it to evolve as a city, what we call a city within a city, into what you will see over time as a number of urban districts, really representing a wide diversity of land uses and activities. It's a long-term plan. However, we know life goes on. Things are going to happen in the near, medium, and longer terms. So what this does is balance that need to set key directions so we don't literally make mistakes along the way, allowing, though, for flexibility, because we want to enjoy and benefit from what comes forward in urban innovation over the next decades. The vision, you can read this at your leisure. I would just highlight that we're dealing with an eclectic mix of uses in the Portlands. We have for a long time, and we're introducing even more and more of those uses. I would emphasize in the vision that we're putting in place what we call a resilient urban structure. It has to stand the test of time and do so in a sustainable way while it allows the area to continue to transition, transform, and evolve. This illustration, it's an illustrative plan, but it gives you a sense and reveals the potential and the framing of the Portlands, framed by the water, framed by generous open spaces, natural areas, and newly created made spaces. Much in keeping with the tradition of waterfront planning in Toronto is breaking it all down into a series of districts, and this is no different. the tradition of precinct planning, and we have before you today as well the first precinct in the Portlands, which is up to bat, which is the Villiers Island plan. But this simply illustrates that it gets broken down into a series of districts. I have for you just a series of what I would call postcards, images of what the future could look like. They're illustrative concepts that reveal the future. This one looking east from Cherry Beach at the Portlands. This one looking west over the Portlands. Again, an illustrative concept that shows you how the city will blend in a natural and organic way, really, into the Portlands over a number of uses, and how the development is situated in what we like to call the theater of the Portlands. There's so many different things happening in the Portlands, and it gives the city a real opportunity to do something really different and exciting with the theater of the city's only working port, which is an incredibly important strategic consideration in the work that we've done. This postcard shows you the new river mouth, the prominence of open space that will take place. Inevitably, when you're creating a new river, you're creating a new river valley for it to behave as it naturally would. And this image gives you that sense. It also, of course, reminds us of the sustainable modes of transportation that we have to implement if this place is going to work in a sustainable way going forward. This postcard really helps us understand the built-up density of what we're proposing, both the residential and the non-residential development. This is not about a suburban style of development. And we've actually got built form policies in the amendment that encourage an intensity of use. We have to make the best use of this land for both residential and non-residential purposes where they're encouraged by the plan. It also illustrates the incredible opportunity we've got to use our heritage resources for their place-making power. And we all know, we've seen examples both in Toronto and around the world of how you can turn something that you never imagined existed there into something that is truly unique and special. This is just an example of how the city could repurpose the McCleary Waste Transfer Station into a public use. The potential for new areas that are completely unknown to the public. This is a great example. This is Keating looking west, where we will create with this plan and with the new river, perhaps the only space like this in the entire city of Toronto, so a place that all Torontonians can come down and celebrate. A spectacular public space that's composed by the water's edge and the water itself. The plan, as I noted, will be framed by important civic, public, and natural realms, and this outlines, and it's in the document for your consideration, all of the very influential parts of the civic, public, and natural realms that will influence the area. Of course, any area of the city, if it's going to stand the test of time, has to have a public street network. This shows you the bones of this long-term plan. It's incredibly important, of course, for mobility, all the modes of travel, and for the city services that lie beneath all the city streets. It's an essential ingredient in bringing revitalization to the Portlands. And of course, that network provides the backbone for both transit and cycling. That is also part of this plan that provides the necessary infrastructure for a sustainable travel system going forward, how we ensure the sustainability of the communities that will be built here over the long term. The work that we've done imagines how the streets will look when you consider the diversity of uses and users that will experience the Portland. And these are just some street profiles that define the public space that will be coming along with the acceleration of the area. This slide highlights the 4-year process. It's really remarkable when you think about it that nobody lives in this area. But we've had an incredible amount of stakeholder interest, as we normally do in the waterfront, and it's only made it better and more enriched. And this slide gives you a sense of what we've done since November 2013 and the amount of consultation that we've had through the process. The range of inputs for a piece of work like this is vast. Really, when you think about it, the opportunity demands a really sophisticated range of inputs. I use the expression no stone unturned. Maybe there are a few, but we have literally been looking in every direction, as this slide illustrates, for all the essential inputs that have produced the plan that we have before you. Also included today in the recommendation package is, as I said, the first precinct plan that's up to bat, the development of the river, which was the subject of the funding announcement by the federal, provincial, and city government earlier in the year. The river's creation will inevitably lead to the creation of this island, and it's a piece of very prudent and essential work to have imagined what this precinct will look like in more detail. So we're putting forward the first plan that has been developed with Waterfront Toronto and their partner consultant Urban Strategies. It gives us the guiding principles and structure and the character of Villiers Island, and it lays down strategies and guidelines that bring forward what is a climate positive area and all of the ingredients really that take it to the next stage and get this area ready for zoning, which is work that is in front of us. I'll just wrap up with a series of slides on what's before you and the actual process. The Central Waterfront Secondary Plan that was approved in 2003 and has been appealed to the Ontario Municipal Board, and we've been working through appeals on that ever since. It includes the Portlands. It did not include a lot of specifics about the Portlands, however, and it certainly is not contemporary. It doesn't include, for example, the new configuration of the river mouth. So we knew that we needed to go back to that document, and because it's under appeal, we're actually proposing, what we're proposing today is a modification that will be considered by the Ontario Municipal Board, not an amendment in the usual sense of the word that would be considered by City Council. So they're the approval authority when it ultimately gets brought forward to the board. And what it does is it inserts a series of detailed policies about the Portlands-wide, a specific policy, and amends a series of maps and schedules to the official plan. This just highlights graphically what those amendments to one of the maps are that allows us to insert the various modifications that have been developed in respect to the area. Also before you today is an actual official plan amendment. So this is the statutory element of this, where we are amending the city's in-force official plan for amendments to the schedules on the road network that allow us, as we have considered the area comprehensively, that allow us to improve the infrastructure in the road network in the area to support future development. Specifically, this is the wedge of land known as south of Eastern, which is just north of the Portlands, up to Eastern Avenue. Finally, the work program that lies ahead, as always with the Portlands, is significant. We are initiating a zoning review. That was kicked off actually at City Council with the adoption of an interim control bylaw at the last meeting. Much needed work to make the zoning more contemporary. We are advancing a precinct plan for McCleary for one of the other districts and urban design guidelines and zoning for the area in a go-forward, very embracive, inclusive zoning bylaw that will support a wide range of uses, including strategic areas such as film and production. What's needed here, because it's an area of employment, is and where people are going to live and work together, we need a Portlands-wide truck management strategy. Further work on low-carbon energy solutions in the Portlands, because we are driving toward a near zero impact in this area, and more estimates on various components of the infrastructure, including hydro. The recommendations of the report before you then specifically are, we're requesting today that you adopt the framework. That is a large document that gives us the overall picture and rationale for the modifications, the actual endorsement of the Villiers Island Precinct Plan, instructions for us to go to the board to seek the approval of the modification, classifications of various areas as Class 4 areas under the Ministry of the Environment to manage the juxtaposition of employment and other sensitive uses through that lens, adoption of the South of Eastern Transportation Official Plan Amendment, and endorsement of the work program. So that is the conclusion of my presentation. Be happy to take your questions perhaps after the deputations. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Greg. That, I think, was our thought, was to have the deputants go first, and then we'll take questions of staff by non-members and members after. So, I have a number of speakers. The first one on the Portlands and Planning Initiative is Peter Epstein, and after that, Julie Beddoes. Is Peter here? I'm looking for Peter Epstein. I don't see him, so I will move on. Julie Beddoes, is Julie here? And after Julie, I have Paul Johnston. And for all of you that are here to speak, and I think you're here earlier, there's 5 minutes, it's the maximum to speak. I will turn on the timer, of course, please watch it. If there are questions, we will ask some of you after. Thank you. Welcome, Julie.
Mr. Chair and councillors, thank you for the opportunity to speak. The Gooderham Worts Neighbourhood Association represents residents of the historic Distillery District, a stone's throw from the northern boundary of the Portlands. We've been privileged to be part of the consultation process as this plan has developed and hope to continue our involvement as development proceeds. We hope that you will adopt the recommendations in front of you. I'd like at this point to give our thanks and commendation to the City, Waterfront Toronto and TRCA staff who've worked with us over the years. They have been quite wonderful. They have produced an extraordinary piece of work. They've always been very courteous and understanding of stakeholder concerns, and they deserve every praise. During the Portlands Acceleration Initiative, stakeholders asked that there be a framework for the whole area so that when development applications come in, they will not be such as to stand in the way of optimal development in the long term. This the documents do very satisfactorily, and there's a lot to applaud here. And it's thrilling for us to see the project move to its next stage. We're beginning to believe it's really going to happen. We salute in particular the commitment to the highest possible environmental standards and zero net energy development. I'd also like to welcome the report's acknowledgement that the future is unpredictable, and to ask that when plans are written into statutorily enforceable documents, the language not be too prescriptive, especially when dealing with land use. The framework calls for a very small amount of residential development and a lot of employment land. I have a hunch that there won't be takers or tenants for so much of the latter, while the amount of residential envisaged for the whole 50-year build-out could probably be filled this year if the price were right. Besides, we have a chance here to do something special and splendid with this extraordinary piece of geography. The prospect of an industrial park does not stir the imagination. With so few residents, it's hard to believe that the hoped-for animated retail and public space and the arts activities wouldn't be dark and deserted most of the time. A larger residential component would also mean more desperately needed affordable housing, without which there's reason to fear that there won't be a workforce to support the employment lands. More residents on this reclaimed brownfield will protect the greenbelt from development pressures and reduce commuting. It's impossible to imagine what kind of industry will exist in 25 years' time and what sort of space it will require. To avoid endless rezonings and official plan appeals over the years, it would be wise to make sure that land use language is very non-prescriptive. This is an extraordinary, extraordinary site with all of the many, many kilometers of water frontage. And I think in our neighborhood, we'd like to see more response to the very special qualities that all of that waterfront access has. It's a fabulous asset to the city to have so much waterfront land fall into its lap. How many big cities at our stage of development in the world have this gift waiting to be made the most of? There seems in the framework plan to be very little provision for boaters, just as a start. The section on recreational use only shows 2 little spots where a boat can be put in the water. But then we have the problem of what to do with what's left of the marine terminal. Perhaps we could kill 2 birds with 1 stone, make that the facility for a marina, a public marina, a yacht club, kids sailing, canoeing facilities for schools, etc., the way we have in the harbourfront area. That could also be a short-term activation project, and in the long term, it could be the catalyst site for Villiers Island that's so much desired, as it would be bringing large numbers of people onto that space and would animate it and make it attractive before the residential and business developers move in. So I leave that as a possibility for what to do with that marine terminal. Our neighbours are very close. Our members are very close neighbours of the Portlands. Our proximity to the waterfront has transformed our area in the past 20 years, and we look forward very much to that transformation going ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there questions of Ms. Meadows? Councillor.
I just want... That's on. There we go.
There you are, Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you for coming, Julie. Always great to see you. The marine terminal, I'm interested in the thinking there as to half of it is now burnt down, as you know, with that fire. And should it remain? Should it be built into the Promontory Park? Do you have a particular thought about that, or idea about how we could get to a good place? I know Heritage staff want to keep it intact. Waterfront Toronto isn't as crazy about that. You're kind of saying there might be something use for it. I'd like to hear a little bit more from you on that.
Well, I think we have a chance to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear here. I think when it was well into the planning process when we heard that Marine Terminal was going to be protected as a heritage building, and it came as a shock. No one thought it was a particularly beautiful or inspiring piece of real estate, and a lot of us were quite relieved when half of it disappeared. But there still is a chance, I think, to use what's left, because as stakeholders have asked for, and as the framework plan calls for, short-term revitalization projects on the Portlands are really important. I mean, all those years ago in the 70s, I think development in the St. Lawrence neighborhood was very much accelerated because the city had the sense to put in some affordable housing down there, and that got the other developers and the co-ops and the private landlords interested in being there. And the short-term projects, I think, are necessary to stimulate that interest. So there we have the shell of a building. You don't have to start from scratch. We have a magnificent access to the water there. Why not combine the two and make it the base for water activities? I don't sail, but I have friends who do, and they tell me there's a real shortage in the city at our present population of waterfront marina space. So as the population grows, there's bound to be more demand. So it seems like both a short-term, probably not terribly expensive thing to do, and in the long term, it could be a real animating catalyst for the whole of Villiers Island.
So just my question again is, since there's two pretty different things, you know, Waterfront Toronto has envisioned that not in the site, and Heritage staff at the city have said you have to have it at all costs. Can you envision a process where we can get to a good place with what to do with that building? What suggestion would you make?
I think we need a really good architect to look at that building and show us what could be made of it. And if it's always going to be an ugly old wreck, then okay, let's get rid of it. But if it can be made into something that's beautiful and an asset to the site, then let's go with Heritage staff and keep it.
Thank you. I'm sure you were as embarrassed as I was when we had.
All right, Councillor, we got lots of deputants.
Oh, sorry.
You're making, if you have a question, ask the question.
I did, and I got that answer.
Right.
I'd just like to have an idea of timelines from her on that, to get this decision made.
Well, the framework plan has a section on the marine terminal asking for investigations and plans, et cetera, et cetera. I forget the wordage. I read nearly 600 pages over the weekend. But I think we could plug something into that section, asking that it be considered as basis for water sports or...
Okay. Thank you very much for that idea.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Councillor Barlow?
Yeah, I just want to make sure I understood correctly, because you mentioned something that you had some concerns about the industrial park feeling of some of these areas. So you're supportive of the employment in the area, because
oh yes, there has to be. Yeah.
You just would like to see it more of a mixed.
Yeah, if I remember, the framework specifies as residential Villiers Island and the McCleary Park area, and I think the demand for housing now will fill those two areas. And then there's the Unilever site, which will need workers, who could presumably live in McCleary Park. So all of the future employment lands, where will their workers come from? Are they going to commute from Richmond Hill? Are we going to sprawl more over the Greenbelt, et cetera, et cetera? I know members of my family are desperately trying to find places to live close to where they work, and I don't think that trend is going to end. So I'm asking that we don't have a rigid percentage of either, that we allow the needs of the future to determine how much residential and how much industrial is built.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions of the deputant? Not seeing any. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for your comments, Ms. Meadows. Paul Johnston? And after that is Rosemary Fry. No, we're going to go through the list as it is. We don't start picking when people can speak.
I'm a land use planner, and I'm here on behalf of Lafarge Canada. And Lafarge is one of the few private owners in the Port Lands area. They own a cement terminal at Polson Quay. And in addition to the cement terminal, which is located, just for those who may not know, just north of the docks property, they're also the operator of a cement facility on Commissioner Street. And to that end, both properties depend upon both road access and water dock wall access to ship their products. And in fact, some of the shipping of cement powder by boat access is a very significant, important use in the Port Lands area. And so I would ask committee members to be mindful of the fact, as Mr. Lintern indicated, that this is the only port in the city, and that the port uses obviously are a very important component going forward in this area. Now, Lafarge has been an active participant in the very extensive planning process in the Port Lands. We have previous written submissions which are attached, the most recent of which is attached to my letter which came to the committee last night. And so I don't propose to go through all of that material in detail. Today what I'd like to do is deal with the highlights of the things that we like about the plan and the areas where we have some ongoing concerns. And a number of the concerns that we've expressed have not yet been addressed. We're hopeful that that will continue, but I also want to tell you about the areas where we've made good progress with planning staff and are supportive of the documents that are before you. And there are a series of documents before you. I'm not going to deal with all of them, but the most important of which for us is are the modifications to the Central Waterfront Secondary Plan. And in the communication I provided to you, there are more detailed comments, but I'm just going to hit some of the areas of particular importance to us and to Lafarge. Firstly, we obviously would be want you to be mindful of the need to ensure that rezoning to permit sensitive uses does not occur until and unless it has been demonstrated these uses are compatible with both the cement terminal, the other industrial uses in the area, and that the modifications to the central waterfront plan should, in our view, ensure that this compatibility is addressed throughout the process and inclusive of site plan approval at the end when the details of a development proposal, a sensitive use, condominium development, for example, is known. And that there are a number of studies that are required to demonstrate that, and this would include noise, odor, air emission, and traffic studies, and that these should be carried out by proponents of such uses, and the document that's before you makes provision for that, so we're happy to see that. And in fact, one of the areas that we're most appreciative of in terms of the work that we've done with planning staff is in the area of land use compatibility, the requirements for studies, the requirement for there to be peer review by the city, and finally that any source mitigation that is a result of those studies has been agreed to by the affected industry. We think by and large that those issues have been addressed. We have spoken in our letter about some implementation areas, some areas where there could be some additional language added, but in broad strokes, we think that the city has listened to industry in terms of the issue of land use compatibility, and we look to work with staff when the matter goes to the OMB to ensure a document that is the best that it can be. Now, one area of particular concern for us, one area where we think there's a significant problem, is the lack so far of a goods movement strategy. Mr. Lintern spoke to you about some of the roads, and he showed you images of detailed work that the city had done in determining road characteristics and cross-sections. Our concern is that that work has advanced to such a point that the incorporation of truck routes, which are not yet known, will be difficult. That pedestrian and cycling and other uses that are made of these roadways will preclude the opportunity for both redundant and appropriate truck routes, and we would ask that, and I know that it's one of the recommendations, that the goods movement strategy move forward as quickly as it can. We have other comments in the document before you.
If I could, Mr. Johnston.
Thank you. I have one final comment. The staff are recommending to you that the area be classified as Class 4 pursuant to the MOE guidelines. We think that's a good step forward, and we support that recommendation. And that really concludes my presentation. And
are there any questions? Councillor Fletcher. Pardon me?
We'll have questions about it. I just wanted to be clear. There is this recommendation that the Deputy City Manager with Waterfront Toronto and relevant divisions, agencies, and corporations develop a Portlands-wide truck management strategy. Is that what you're talking about as a goods and movement strategy?
Yes, Councillor Fletcher. No, that is one and the same thing, yes.
I see. Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Are there other questions of the deputant? So, Mr. Johnson, I have a brief question. You're at the mouth of what the new river will be. That's where you are now, and that's where you'll be staying.
Yes.
You load and you unload from ships for how many months of the year?
Probably 8 to 9 months of the year.
So there's about 3 to 4 months in the winter when you're not there, when the ships aren't there.
That's correct.
But you continue your operations all year long.
All year long, yes.
And you think that you can work effectively with the plan that's here, with the development that's proposed in the area?
Yes, I mean the final completion of the naturalization is going to bring challenges, but we're there when there's a dock wall. We use the dock wall. It's integral to the use, and through our discussions with staff and with Waterfront Toronto, it's our understanding that the two can coexist, that being the naturalization and the dock wall.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Thank you very much for
Thank you.
I have Rosemary Fry. Same thing, you're here, you have 5 minutes. I'll let you know just before it's up if you haven't caught the clock. If there's questions, we'll ask them from you.
Thank you. So as a resident in Toronto, I just want to echo what Julie Beddoes said, that she and all of us would like to see the needs of the future and the people determine how much industrial and how much residential development goes on the site and of Portlands. And council has been pretty heavily lobbied by some of the heaviest hitting lobbyists in Toronto. We're talking Stephen Adler and John Duffy and others on behalf of Pinewood and Cinespace. So, and it's hard as residents or as average people to put that much pressure to bear on councillors and say, and stand up and say, our needs should come first. And I'm sure many of you have seen the article by Christopher Hume, the op-ed a couple days ago, and he is pretty strongly, that's why I came here. I read this and I went, wow. I'll just read a teeny bit of it. He said that this scheme that is coming before you today would give much of the site for massive movie studios, sound facilities, and back lots. This would amount to building an industrial park on some of the most potentially valuable land in the city. The mind boggles at the short-sightedness, the blinkered vision, the lack of ambition and imagination, and the sheer thoughtlessness of such a plan. So I would just urge you to maybe try to declutter your minds from all the lobbying that's happened and think about why would somebody like that who cares about the city speak so strongly about what's happening. It's happening very quickly as well. It was only a few months ago that the tripartite agreement from all three levels of government came forward, and now boom, this is happening in a very short time. So yeah, we're concerned. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions of the deputant?
I just wondered if you'd
Councillor
also...
Fletcher would like to ask a question of you, Rosemary.
I just wondered if you'd also had a chance to look at the John Lawrence article, where he talks a little bit about the Christopher Hume article. And
oh, no, I didn't read it.
There are some differences between our major thinkers on how to approach this. So you haven't had a chance to look at that?
No.
Okay.
It's very good.
Is it?
Probably see it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. So the next deputant I have is Mary Flynn Guglietti. I saw her around here before. And you've been here before, so you know the 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I also have with me Mr. Ray Davies of Portlands, and he too is listed as a deputant. But what we're going to do is split our time to make things a little bit faster for the committee, if that's...
Thank you.
Is that acceptable, sir?
He's listed as the next deputant. Let's go.
Thank you. I do have a couple of visuals that I'm hoping will be of assistance in my presentation. Hopefully that helps. Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Mary Flynn Guglietti, and I'm the solicitor representing Ontario Power Generation. You will note in the materials that you have in front of you that there was a letter filed yesterday by Connie Hergert, who's the Vice President of Real Estate Services for Ontario Power Generation. And so that you know where the Ontario Power Generation lands are located, they're located at 470 Unwin Avenue, and that is where you will find the Portlands Energy Center and 440 Unwin Avenue, and that's the former Hearn generating station. I don't profess to go through the letter, and you will note that attached to that letter is a letter dated May 25th. And that's a very, very detailed letter that we did send to the Strategics Initiative Unit with respect to our comments on the draft. And why we're here today is that we do believe, and I did hear Mr. Lintern say that no stone was left unturned. Regretfully, some of the stones were ignored. And the reason why I say that, and it's more of a historical comment, we, on behalf of OPG, did put in a formal objection to the City of Toronto official plan and the waterfront secondary plan. These date back to 2003 and 2005. In that, we raised three very critical issues to our client. And those three issues remain unresolved today. And although we have participated in settlement discussions with staff with respect to those appeals, they were never satisfactorily resolved. And those concerns stay today. And before I get on to that, I just want to show you the ownership map. And Mr. Lintern did put that ownership map up. But you will note in looking at the ownership land that most of the land is owned by the City of Toronto. However, if I can go back to this map, when you look at some of the major changes to the land uses, most of them occur on private property, and the OPG lands are private property. So just so that you have an idea of what I'm talking about, this is the PEC, and that's the old Hearn building, and that's the hydro switchyard. And you do have comments today in your materials from both PEC and from Hydro One raising similar concerns to the concerns we are raising. This area in here is proposed to be parks and open space. And then there is back here the pedestrian cycling that will go all the way through the back. And what you have to take into consideration is this is introducing what I would call sensitive land uses, not residential, but the notion that this will be public open space on private property, inviting the public to come onto the site, where you have a hydro switchyard, you have PEC, and you have the old Hearn, which is now subject to a long-term lease with respect to the film industry. These are industrial uses, and actually very significant industrial uses. Thankfully, because of the construction of the PEC site, we don't have the brownouts that we used to have in the City of Toronto. Population is increasing, the need for power is increasing exponentially in the City of Toronto, and it is critical that we maintain the ability to not only exist as we exist today, but to expand into the future. I don't think that the city wants to start having brownouts again. So we have to be able to have the potential to expand. In addition to that, the Hearn site, as you'll know, was at one point operated by coal. Where you're showing open space and inviting the public on that site is where coal was situated. That's not healthy. That's public safety issues. We're concerned about people on the network having safety issues, being in such close proximity to the switchyard, to the PEC site, and to the industrial Hearn site. These are not good land uses to put one on top of the other. And also, you've put them on private property without, even though we have been saying since 2003 that this is not a good idea. It's not good land use planning to put these uses, sensitive land uses, in close proximity to very significant, important uses to the City of Toronto, and to do so without taking into consideration the land use conflicts and the public safety issues. Now, if you look at our letter, the issues that we raised is that we don't believe that there's been a recognition of preserving the existing uses, but we also think that you have not...
Mary, you're going into Ray's time now?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
And he's happy to be quiet while you speak?
Yes, he is. Thank you.
Wonderful relationship there.
But he will help me answer questions.
Okay, thank you.
So with respect to some of the things I'd like to point out, there are in the Provincial Policy Statement 2014 a requirement that includes electricity generation facilities and transmission lines to be protected, and that they should not permit development in planned corridors that could preclude or negatively affect the use of the corridor for the purposes for which it was identified. As well, under the Electricity Act, it protects this particular use and the expansion of this use as long as it meets the regulations in the future. I have already mentioned the land use compatibility issues, so I won't go any further on that. And then also, I would like to point out the fragmentation of our client's property. I'm going to use this other map for that purpose, mindful of my time. I wouldn't have been a good dentist. As you can see, there's the Broadview Avenue extension that goes through our client's property, and there is the Unwin Avenue that would go through. These are trails here, here, and here. And when you look at this, what you see is that it fragments our client's property. It actually creates a separate block here and makes virtually all of the land down here unusable by our client. And it is very, pardon? Oh, I'm sorry. If you look at the location of the Broadview extension and the extension of Unwin Avenue, it creates a fragmentation of our client site. So the property south of Unwin and the property west of the Broadview extension would be separated and segregated for the remainder of the site. So in the future, then we're trying to plan for future uses such as the expansion of the PEC site or the expansion of any electricity generation on that site. That would have a negative impact on our client. And this again is all being done on private lands. And I don't want to go back to the map that I showed you initially, which is the land use ownership lands. But if you look at the City of Toronto parcels, none of the City of Toronto parcels are so negatively impacted by these roads, by these trails, and by the imposition of the open space designation that occurs on any other industrial property in this particular area. We've been raising these concerns with the city since 2003, 2005. We're a party to the OMB hearing, and we're raising them again. These issues have not been resolved, and we certainly appreciate and respect the ability of the City of Toronto to plan for the Portlands in the future. But we have to be mindful of the industries that are there, and this industry in particular, because this particular site is very critical to the City of Toronto in terms of power generation, and we cannot ignore the significance of that. Those are my submissions, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have, and as well, Mr. Ray Davies will assist me in that regard.
So Ray, you were a deputant, but all your comments have been made?
More or less, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Great way to extend the time. Yes, I understand that. We'll deal with that. Councillor Fletcher, you said you had some questions?
Yes, it's a question for Mr. Davies. When did OPG become a private corporation?
Through you, Mr. Chair, OPG became, through demerger in 1999, we became a private company. Our sole shareholder is the province, so we are in some ways much like a public corporation, but we are under the Act a private corporation.
Much like Toronto Community Housing would be under an act of a private corporation.
Correct.
But understanding that even though you're under the act of a private corporation, the underlying land ownership for Toronto Community Housing, as an example, is the City of Toronto. Is the underlying land ownership not the province of Ontario?
Through Mr. Chair, the land ownership's under legal title to Ontario Power Generation, the company. However, any land use decision or if we were to dispose or manage the site has to go through our shareholder, the province.
So that's very typical for a publicly, for public lands with a corporation that is a private corporation. Would you agree with me? There's many of those.
I believe there are many. I'm only familiar with my company.
Right,
but,
I know. Yeah. But as a corporation under the Ontario Corporations Act, that the underlying land ownership and decisions regarding the land are under the province through the ORC.
That's not accurate. The ORC, so there,
we would need to understand this completely.
Okay. Any land use decision we would make, if we were selling the property, if we were buying a property, we would approach our shareholder to advise them. And if there was a concern from the province, we would be told, given direction as to what. Right. Because that's ultimately our shareholder, and we wouldn't make a decision without their blessing.
But your shareholder could also make decisions about you as an entity. Is that correct or not?
I suppose they could.
So, and your shareholder could make decisions about the land use and initiate that with you. Is that correct? As the underlying owner, if they wanted something to happen, they would approach you as the corporation and have that conversation.
Absolutely, they could.
So how much of a conversation have you had with your shareholder, or you understand your shareholder has representatives on the board of Waterfront Toronto directly as one of the tri-governments? How many conversations have you had directly with your shareholder about their aspirations for the Portlands and their underlying land ownership as being part of a plan?
I can't speak to that through Mr. Chair. There hasn't been a real reason for in my understanding, to approach any of the members of the Waterfront Toronto. That may be on, there might be members of the provincial cabinet or whatever, but there hasn't been, this is the only change that we're looking at now, and as our solicitors indicated, there's a number of fundamental changes that
Thank you.
affect our use of this.
I also understand that you're planning to sell the Hearn
I'm not aware of that.
to the leaseholder. Is that correct?
They, under the lease
Perhaps your
agreement.
lawyer knows about that.
I'm their municipal lawyer. I don't do any
Okay,
real
you
estate
don't do
work.
real estate.
Under the lease agreement that we have with Studios of America, they have first right of offer to purchase it, but I'm not aware of if they've enacted that right.
And your position is, again?
I'm a
You're
real
the
estate.
manager, real estate strategy, so you would be aware if the Hearn was being offered now to Mr. Cordellucci, or not?
It's not, in fairness, it's not my file at
Well,
the
you're
office.
coming here today to talk about your land.
I'm a planner
So I'm
by
going to assume you
background.
know about that. Are you telling me categorically that it is not up for sale? The Ontario government is not planning, your shareholder is not planning to sell that?
If I may assist, I believe that, through you, Mr. Chair, to the councillor.
Thank you.
I believe that what Mr. Davies said was that there is a long-term lease.
We understand that.
And within that long-term lease is a right of first refusal.
I do understand
So
that.
if and
I'm asking
when-
if that's being triggered, actually. Is that
If and when they want to sell the land, he would have the right to first refusal.
That's not my question, Ms. Gugliotti. My question is, has that been triggered? Has that been offered up, as many people have heard, as the province is now looking to sell the Hearn and it's being offered first?
I believe there have been discussions in that regard.
You believe there have been discussions recently in that regard?
Yes.
Councillor
You'd say
Fletcher.
recently. Thank you. I had to, they're here. I get a chance
I've got
to
it.
do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Perks, bringing it to committee for questions.
Thank you. I just want to pursue a couple of the questions that Councillor Fletcher was after. Just to better understand what your entity is, you're a Crown corporation, is that correct?
We're a private corporation.
Yes, I know, but I just looked up on your website and you describe yourself as a Crown corporation, is that correct?
I've been told technically by our council internally, we're not a Crown corporation per se, but we function very much like a Crown corporation. Because there's a Business Corporations Act that
I'm aware of the Business Corporations Act, and we have the same issue with Toronto Hydro. They, their charter is in compliant with the Business Corporations Act. Nevertheless, they are a City of Toronto agency owned by us. Similarly, you're owned by the province, making you a Crown corporation. Is that correct?
That's fair.
Which makes the land you sit on Crown land. Ultimately, if they're the 100% shareholder, that's correct, isn't it?
Like if you went to look at it as a legal description on title, the owner of the land is actually Ontario Power Generation.
Which is a Crown corporation 100% owned by the people of Ontario.
Its sole shareholder is the province of Ontario. That's correct.
Which makes that Crown land.
No, technically, no.
Oh, you're not getting a direct...
I have a point. I'm allowed to ask my question.
But you asked it, they're not answering you.
Okay, thank you. In the letter that you submitted, I don't have the date on it, I can't find it, but you referenced it. On page 2 at the bottom,
Yes.
you make the point that, you believe there's authority that we have to protect those lands in case you want to expand your use of fossil fuels.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, if I can explain that section of the Electricity Act. What the Electricity Act does is it stipulates that if the lands were occupied and used in the City of Toronto in connection with the generation of electricity using fossil fuels.
It's electricity using fossil fuels.
Correct. So
Okay,
if it was,
the gentleman from Ontario Power Generation, does the province of Ontario have a plan to increase the production of fossil fuels in the City of Toronto?
Through Mr. Chair, I'm not aware that they do.
That there is a long-term energy strategy for the province of Ontario.
Correct, and my understanding is imminent. It's going to be released in the next month or so.
But there's a current one.
There is a current one.
And does the current one imagine the increase of the use of fossil fuels in the City of Toronto?
Not to my awareness, but that, again, that could change depending on the latest long-term energy plan.
And, yeah, and I'm aware of the province's long-term energy plan in broad strokes, and similarly, we have our own long-term climate plan. Don't both of them imagine a reduction in the use of fossil fuels, not an increase?
That would be accurate.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that I understood the answer you gave Councillor Fletcher about the conversations around the Hearn site. You said there have been conversations. Has part of the agreement been legally triggered to initiate those conversations? Like, has someone filed is the Hearn group or Mr. Cortellucci filed a document with you saying we want to pursue this?
My understanding, there have been discussions for years with Stewards of America on the potential of it. I guess I can't speak to the details around the engagement because it's actually not my file.
Do you think it would be possible to provide the city with a clear answer on that? You could go back and talk to your colleagues? Thank you very much.
And Mr. Chairman, if I may just finish the quote on the Electricity Act. What that section says is that any site that was used for electricity through fossil fuels prior to the date of March of 1999 can continue or can introduce any uses that comply with the regulations. So those would be whatever regulations are passed by the province under the Electricity Act. So it's just permitting the full range of whatever regulations would permit.
I guess I do have another question then. So do you imagine building a solar farm, a biomass plant, or a windmill on that site?
I believe those all would be permitted.
No, I'm just asking, is that part of the plan for the site?
We haven't investigated those options, but I wouldn't rule out anything. It's alternative. OPG is actually commencing our first solar project at our Nanticoke site. So if there's
I imagine
opportunity,
it has a much bigger footprint than the lands we're talking about here.
Councillor Perks.
Yeah.
Thank you. Other questions by other members? Councillor Campbell.
So how much land does OPG own here in this area? So this is the land is owned by OPG?
this land is correct.
How much land does OPG own there?
It's approximately 80 acres.
Pardon me?
It's approximately 80 acres.
80.
That's correct.
80. And how much? What is the PEC?
Okay, if I can point it out on the map, see the white.
I know. I see. I've got the map. I see it on the. Oh, no, what is it? There's no. I have no idea what it is.
Oh, that
Sorry, it's
is.
the Portland's Energy Center.
Okay.
And it's a gas plant.
It's a gas plant.
That's
it's
correct.
producing energy, producing electricity. It's power generation. Oh, okay.
For the city of Toronto.
Right. Okay. Okay. So I didn't know that because that's not in the report that I've seen. And how the site that is now leased, how large is that site?
Out of the 80 acres.
Sorry?
Is it about half the site? Because there's actually, you own a bit of land north of the ship channel.
That is correct.
A small parcel. What's happening to that?
North of the ship channel.
Do you mean the pedestrian?
Well, I'm just, I'm going by the map on where the provincial land is. And in the presentation, it is slide 3, and there's a strip of land that's provincially owned north of the channel. Do you know anything about that? If you don't, it's okay.
Sorry, I'm just trying to detail where, are you talking about along the promenade on the north side of the PEC or the Portland's Energy?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so OPG doesn't own that. That's owned by TEDCO. So we have a lease through TEDCO for use of that land.
You lease the land from TEDCO?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
But if I could, through you, Mr. Chair, if I could explain that lease. That lease is for 999 years. So a lease of that length is considered almost as if you do own it.
Yes, that's a.
So we do consider
I know.
that.
You're not adding to this by extending all this. Please just answer the question if we can get on with it.
And the Hearn, just out of curiosity, so one of your objections to the way that the city has operated in your talks is that you don't feel that the city has been, or you feel that the city is enabling incursion onto the OPG property. Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
And Does part of the objection relate to the Hearn site as well? The incursion on the Hearn site?
That is correct. It is all, those lands are currently owned by OPG.
Right.
And it will have roads through it.
Right.
And pedestrian crossways and bicycle paths.
But if the Hearn site is to potentially be sold to the leaseholder, you wouldn't obviously have any objection to what the city does in that regard, under those circumstances.
We would still be, through you, Mr. Chairman, we would still be concerned because we would continue to own the PEC site, and we would continue to have that long-term lease interest.
So can you explain explain again the incursion on the PEC site? Oh, and actually, I didn't get the other question answered. How big is the Hearn site and how big is the PEC site? So you have 80 acres. What's the split?
I can point it out on the map.
Yeah, it's, unfortunately, I don't have a good map to show you, but in terms of acres, it's about 50/50.
It's about 50, it looks about 50/50.
Yeah.
Okay. So the 40 acres that's the PEC site, you say that the incursions may inhibit your ability to expand on that site.
Yeah, just to follow up through, Mr. Chair, I think it's the straightening of Unwin as it comes up. There's some significant impact on the current Portland's Energy Center, how they use their lands as part of their operation. The opportunity, and I think it would adversely affect the opportunity, should there ever be a need for another generation type, whether it be gas or solar or anything else, it's coming very close to those lands. On the Hearn site, as Mary Flynn had indicated, it's the bridge crossing at Broadview coming across. It fragments the westerly portion of the site on the Hearn side, and then similarly, the Unwin realignment comes very close to the stack.
Okay.
That's already.
So in your discussions with the city, you've raised all of these concerns, and what's been the city's response?
The city's response is to continue to fragment the lands with the extensions of Broadview and with the extension of Unwin, and to continue to have the cycling and pedestrian.
So your concerns have been dismissed? Right.
They have since 2005. We raised these concerns with the secondary plan and the city's OP back in 2003, 2005.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I have a question, but first of all, Ms. Nguglietti, deputants get 5 minutes. There's a second deputant, they get 5 minutes. The first deputant can't bring a second deputant, and I won't permit it in the future to speak for them. You know it's not right because you've been here before. I wouldn't allow it for Councillor Perks to bring people here to do that. And if you do wish to extend it, then have the second person carry on with speaking, because that's the appropriate way to deal with us. Otherwise, everyone will come here with 2 or 3 people and give us a 15-minute speech because 2 other people have registered with them, and it's really not appropriate. In regards, you said that Mr. Duffy and Mr. Adler had been lobbying?
No.
Or somebody else did? Okay. I was checking on that. In regards to the plans that are here, the current plan acknowledges the fact that it's used for power generation on the entire site. Am I correct? And the go-forward plan?
Absolutely, we would be able to go forward, Mr. Chairman, with the current
as long as it
uses on
stays in the
property.
current ownership, you can continue to use it and expand upon it for the use.
Well, the expansion would be a different story. We would have to go through site plan approval.
Site plan approval, but the use is permitted on the site. So the possibility of the roads or the bike trail across the waterfront or all that would only come if there was a application made to change uses on the land. Am I right?
Well, you are, Mr. Chairman, sorry. If we were to go through site plan approval, I'm just imagining from my experience, having done this for 34 years, the minute that we do that, the city would ask for the dedication of the lands for these roads and as well for the pedestrian cycling path to be provided to the city free of charge as part of the site plan approval process. Yes, they
Through the site plan approval process. I'll come to staff after.
Yeah.
When has that happened before, that we've had a site plan without a development application and someone has said that we want to take land for it?
It is permitted. It is permitted as of right, sir, to the municipality when you are processing.
And then
You
what
have to give road
proximity?
widenings, you have to give dedication
What
of lands.
proximity do you have to have And I guess it's more of a technical question, Mr. Davies. How far away does this generating plant have to be from the public? Because I've seen them, and I've seen them in other countries. They're buildings that burn gas and create electricity. And I don't know how far away they really have to be because it's a danger there. But what is the distance they have to be?
Mr. Chair, the provincial policy statement, there's compatibility policies that the province had introduced in the 2014 PPS provincial policy statement, and it doesn't define a distance, but I think this would be something if you were introducing sensitive land uses like the parks and open space from an existing major facility, I believe is the definition, and then a gas plant would be that. You would have to do a site-specific study to understand what a setback ought to be.
Right, but one of the questions was doing a pedestrian trail across the edge of the ship channel. So either it could be done on land that is currently under provincial ownership, or if I'm correct, the city then could do it into the ship channel by hanging it on the side of it. Is that a dangerous use where you'd oppose it to have a walking trail along the edge of that property?
Well, that is like the green here, the light green, that's the hydro property, and they have massive equipment there that people would get electrocuted from if they were to go.
I think, through design, you could mitigate it, no question. I think the general concern would be from a setback, and there is an existing major facility there juxtaposed beside the park or open spaces there. Would it introduce a risk to the operation or introduce a risk to public safety? I don't think the fact that there's a trail there is necessarily by itself an issue. It's just it's unusual in some ways to have trails that close to a facility of that sort.
And then this is an official plan amendment, so really it would come into play if there was a change of use on the land or an application for the city for those changes, and it'll be considered at that time. So your objection now seems to be one based on the fact that you don't want to see any changes now, and I don't think that there are any changes being contemplated now. This is a 50-year plan, and you're saying you don't want to see any changes in the next 50 years.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I think the answer to the question is simply that when we plan, even when we plan into the 50-year horizon, we have to be cognizant of, are we putting land uses side by side that are compatible? Are we creating roads and trails that are compatible with what's there, what could be there in the future?
Sorry,
and I don't believe that's what we're doing.
There's no question about putting this in if what's there stays there.
No, not if we do site plan approval. Not if we do site plan approval.
For changes on the site.
No, but if you look at the recommendations, sir, under recommendation 7A, it is instructing staff to immediately start going through the zoning process to ensure that the zoning bylaw totally complies with the official plan. So that is recommendation 7A in staff's recommendations today that you're being asked to approve. So you'd have the OP and the zoning would follow right behind.
But that only comes into play if there are changes to the use. Your current facility can maintain. If you wish to generate in the old facility, which was a decision that was not financially viable, that's why it's still rented out supposedly as a film studio, that could become generating, and none of that would be affected by this plan if those uses were continued. But if you wish to change the uses on the land or come in for something new on it, then this would fall into place.
If we were to expand in the future, sir, and had to go through site plan approval, we would probably be asked to provide those dedications for the land and for the walkway and the pedestrian cycling free of charge to the city at the time of the site plan.
Okay, and if you were to sell it, then the new owner would have to go through that, right?
We would, or a different owner, that's correct.
So if we put a plan in place and the property is sold, it would be good to have the new owner know what we were planning to do if he purchases the property, wouldn't it?
Except we're suggesting that if it's going to remain in our ownership, we are very concerned.
Correct, but there's an option if you decide not to purchase by the existing owner. So isn't it better that the existing lessee, if he wishes to purchase it, knows that there's this plan in place from the city so he doesn't buy it blindly?
Well, I don't think that anybody who's interested in purchasing this site would be buying it blindly. They would have to do their due diligence, sir.
Which is why we should have an official plan on it so they know what our vision is.
Except that that vision has an impact on our current ownership.
If it's for power generating. Thank you. I won't belabor it. Are there any other questions? I don't see any. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I have next Kathy McDonald, co-chair, Federation of North Toronto Residents Association, then Mr. John Wilson. Is Kathy here? There you are.
So I'm, Kathy McDonald, co-chair of FONTRA, but I'm not representing FONTRA today, particularly on this issue. My involvement in the waterfront in the Portlands goes back to helping set up the whole idea of having a waterfront corporation and getting it in place. So I'm very pleased to be here today and see the Portlands plan developed to the extent that it has. I'm also a boater, and like Julie Beto, kind of concerned that the plan proposals don't really reflect the opportunity for recreational boating that is offered by the Portlands with its location by the harbor, the outer harbor, and the ship channel. And I was very pleased to see in Greg's presentation boating on the Keating Channel. This is a fabulous resource for the city, and I was looking for objectives about using Portland's area to promote recreational boating. So that's sort of one point I wanted to raise. The second is the issue of the balance of residential and industrial development in the Portlands, and that in particular the special protection for the film industry, which really has come to the Portlands recently, and I would imagine could go away when the land prices get higher, or if the industry incentives change or the format of producing films changes. So putting in stone protections for a kind of transitional land use, I'm concerned about. So otherwise, I think the plan is looking good. I like the marine facilities proposal at Cherry Street, which is part of promoting recreational boating. So that's all I wanted to say today.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions of the deputants? Thank you for coming down and seeing us. Then I have Mr. John Wilson.
Thank you, Chair and Councillors. I'm John Wilson. I'm co-chair of the West Don Lands Committee. West Don Lands Committee has been intimately involved with the planning and public consultation on the waterfront and the Portlands since our foundation in 1997. So we've been at this for quite some time. So thank you for the chance to speak to you on this important city building initiative. The Portlands Planning Initiative is made possible, as you know, by the commitment of the city, the province, and the federal government to fund 1/3 each of the $1.25 billion project to naturalize and flood protect the mouth of the Don River. This project is beginning this fall, and over 7 years it will create and naturalize 3 separate river mouth spillways and open up a wide swath of 800 acres of land in the Portlands where the city can grow sustainably for at least the next generation. This is tremendously exciting, and there is great public interest and a committed waterfront community who have been engaged in the process of building this initiative for coming on to 30 years now. I'm confident in saying that It is the public support and commitment to the Don River and the waterfront that has driven this initiative forward and kept it on track. The Prime Minister, the Premier, do not come to Toronto's waterfront to stand with the Mayor and announce major funding for our waterfront unless they know that there is a public support behind it, that the public is expecting and demanding government action to build our community and make our city resilient to economic disruption and changing climate. It is very challenging to comment substantively on the 500 pages of the framework plan, the Villiers Island Precinct Plan, and the official amendment that have been issued and reissued over the past week. This is because the consultation process that the community seems to have gone off the rails in the past year. I say this because after broad public engagement over several years, there's been no public open house this year and no stakeholder meetings since March. There is much to like in the Portland's Framework Plan and the Villiers Island Precinct Plan. There are some truly inspiring pieces: the 50-year visionary language, the biodiversity framework, the mixed-use plans for Villiers Island, and the work that's been done to make the Don River mouth the centerpiece for our waterfront. The elevated language of the vision statements, the 6 essential elements, big and diverse, urban and wild, etc., the transitional moves, the 12 objectives, these are generally very inspiring and positive, but they've only been out in front of an engaged public in their final form for about a week. So we feel confident that it's hard to feel confident that they have been road tested. There is a feeling that the consultation process and framework developed by Waterfront Toronto in the past has been sidelined. A community-driven safety net beneath the Portland's planning process is still crucial. We see serious risks that the process will be short-circuited at the outset. We have been raising concerns about the specific land use direction categories for the McCleary District, Film Studio District, River South, and Polson districts for months, but these have been ignored. What we feel is missing is a transparent process to govern the transition from the unvarnished potential of the present through the transformation of the Don River and the build-out of neighboring communities over 20 to 50 years. Particularly concerning to us are the strict categories set out in the land use direction. We feel that they do not allow the innovative approach that has been brought to Quayside by Waterfront Toronto. And primarily, we're looking for innovative and transparent ways to keep the public engaged in governing the evolution of the Portlands. That is why the West Don Lands Committee is collaborating with other groups to create a coalition called Waterfront for All. We hope that to begin the process, starting with our Waterfront Summit to be held on October 27 and 28, of putting the public back at the center of Portland's revitalization. We have a hard time giving blanket endorsement to the planning framework and the Villiers Island Precinct Plan at this time because we have had a fairly brief time to look at it together and discuss it together. But we are looking at this moment as an opportunity to work with all parties at the city, at Waterfront Toronto, and in the communities across the waterfront to put the waterfront vision back on the rails as a movement springing from and led by the people of Toronto.
John, I needed you to
Thank you.
sum up. Thank you. Are there questions of the deputant?
Yes. Hi, John. Thank you.
So, Councillor Fleischer, you have questions?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Can't tell. No, it's on. Were you surprised to hear OPG believes that they directly own the land under the 80 acres that comprises the Hearn and the Portland Energy Center?
I am. I really don't know the ins and outs of the Business Corporations Act, but I have always considered the Hearn, the Portland's Energy Center to be public lands.
And were you concerned when you heard that there are currently discussions to sell the Hearn underway, that 40-acre site, to a private owner?
And
remove the lands from
remove the lands from public ownership. I would like to see those lands remain in public ownership. I would like to see us have the wherewithal to guide and direct what happens at the Hearn. The Hearn is a fantastic resource, and as long, we need to be in the driver's seat on the Hearn.
And does it concern you that as a Crown Corporation of the province of Ontario?
Counselor.
What?
Could we have him, could you address your questions to his deputation, because you're now addressing,
Framework.
you're addressing your questions to the deputation in regards to the Portland project. His concern with that, and he's talking about the plan that's here.
And the plan contemplates things for the Hearn, and it contemplates, as I see,
understand that,
those
but
are
he
provincial
isn't-
lands.
That's correct, but those questions were probably placed with representatives of OPG.
As a longtime interested
I understand
citizen,
that.
I needed to hear if,
I know, I
Wilson knew
had
that.
you do some of those questions, but he's expressed his concern about their plans.
okay, thank you. Sorry, apparently
go
I
ahead.
didn't ask you those questions, but thank you for answering them anyway.
Oh, you're welcome.
And you've mentioned that you're having this Waterfront for All Summit.
Yes.
Where is it, that going to be at, where's that going to
It's going to be at the George Brown College waterfront campus,
be there?
the evening of Friday, the 27th, and all day 28th.
And have you got the city and Waterfront Toronto coming to that?
Yes.
Okay, great. And do you think any of these items that we've discussed today, including the one I'm not supposed to ask you about, might be a topic of conversation?
I'm hoping that, as I'm saying, I'm hoping that we reintroduce the public fulsomely into all the discussions that happen on the waterfront, including what happens at the Hearn, including what happens throughout the Portlands and along the waterfront from Etobicoke to Scarborough, and this is what our goal is.
But there is a stakeholder group for the Portlands Planning Framework, and I'll ask that. I believe there's been quite a few meetings since the waterfront.
Yes, and I want to see this going forward through the...
You've been part of that stakeholder.
I have been part of that.
And it's met quite a few times, met a number of times.
Yes, my concern is that it seems to have tailed off over the past year, and that's why I want to see it robust going forward.
But this isn't a stakeholder group that you're talking about. This is an advocacy group.
Waterfront for All is an advocacy group, yes.
Okay, I'll ask the staff about the stakeholder groups, because I believe there's two. There's a land use group,
That's right.
and you'd agree that there are issues around land use here and private, where the lands are privately owned, that make things not as straightforward, and that was part of the problem with the 2010 environmental assessment, that some of these major private landowners hadn't been accounted for.
My hope would be that the landowner and the stakeholder groups both collaboratively go forward as input into the process as we go forward on the Portlands going forward.
And that this is a document here today that is from Waterfront Toronto and the City of Toronto.
It is.
So it's not as if it's a City of Toronto document. And I'll clarify that with staff, that this is signed off by both agencies, both the city and our agency.
Yes.
Great, thanks so much for all of your efforts. Marine Terminal 2035, Julie Beddoes, Ms. Beddoes suggested that it could be maintained and perhaps repurposed. Would you be okay with that thinking, to pull everybody together to see what the future of that should be, or are you still...
Marine Terminal?
Yeah.
My preference has been to see that turned into parkland and made, if the Marine Terminal is to remain, to have it as minimal a footprint as is reasonable. But I also think that I'm not the only wise voice on that matter, and I think that there needs to be a continuing public engagement as to what to do there.
So if I asked for a process for that, you'd be happy?
I would be very happy.
Okay, great, thank you.
Members of committee, this was the last deputant. There might be a little bit more in questioning, and there was an item I held. Could I just have a vote to extend to deal with the item that we had held, which was the PG 23.2, the solar panels? I can do that, and questions of the deputant, and then our deputations will be finished. We can come back after lunch and ask questions of staff. So motion to extend for that purpose. All in favor of just to ask questions of the last deputant and then deal with an item that we held earlier. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Are there other members of committee that have questions of this deputant? Okay, so I do have a brief question. So, Mr. Wilson, you said the meeting stopped in March, right? But then the document came out in draft form publicly in June.
Yes,
And
in May.
In May.
And there was a draft, yes.
So, but
May
you saw
31st.
previous reiterations of the draft, I believe, over a period of time. Staff were working up to that meeting with what they were looking at to put on this framework that your organization was aware of, the drafts in the past?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
So this is the final document.
Yes.
I've never seen a final document this thick being done without there being drafts of it and recommendations. It's my understanding that you had some opportunities with your group to know what was in all the drafts and had input as to the direction that staff were going in up until March or so of the year when it was your last meeting. Am I correct?
Yes, we had our last stakeholder meetings in March, and then there was the draft document in May.
The document itself, but there were previous drafts of that. And you were,
yes.
I'm not trying to be picky as a lawyer on it.
Mm-hmm.
The point I'm trying to make is the direction that the staff were going in and the recommendations that they were going in, they did have multiple discussions with your organization up until March.
Yes.
And then they finalized their draft at that time and made that public.
Yes.
So they had their meetings until then, and then it's a public document for everyone else to see.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And then just a point, I have no further questions. Does anyone else? Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Appreciate you coming. There was a comment made earlier about 2 lobbyists that were apparently by one of the people that were lobbying members. So I had my staff check, and Mr. Duffy has no registrations of any public meetings with any of us. And because I was questioning whether he had lobbied any of us, and I see none. Although he did register to represent Pinewood as of May in 2016. And Mr. Adler did register also in May of 2016, sent some emails in, but only met with a few of the councillor staff, never with the councillors. So I really only bring that up because it's not appropriate, I don't think, to say that we had been lobbied extensively on plans when none of us on the committee to the registration show that we've ever met with those 2 individuals. So that was just a... And, well, none of it. The note is that only Councillor Crawford, Kelly, that your staff, Councillor Flesher, may have been contacted by Mr. Adler, but not yourself or ourselves or anyone. The item that I just wanted to deal with was the one that we held, which was the request for a report on residential solar panels protection provisions. And I spoke with the staff, and they're fine to come back with it in the new year and add it into their work plan. So I would just like to move the recommendations, to adopt the recommendations that Councillor Mihevc has asked us to do in his memo to us. Also move. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. We'll come back after lunch and start with questions of staff, and then we'll go to speakers on this item. And we have 2 other items left after that. PG 23.7 and 23.8. So we are back at 1:30.